Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. Stephen McGuirk, one of the experts instructed to assist the inquiry. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
May I call Mr. McGuirk?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. McGuirk.
Good morning, sir.
I gather you're going to affirm.
I am indeed.
Then please would you read the words on the screen in front of you.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Kinnear, when you're ready.
Thanks, sir. Would you please confirm your name for the record?
Stephen McGuirk.
Mr. McGuirk, many thanks for attending today. Good morning.
Good
There
morning.
are three things I should say before you start to give evidence today. The intention is that my questions are short. Sometimes they're not. Hopefully they should also be clear, but sometimes they're not. If they are long and unclear, please say so, and I shall try and correct matters. Secondly, if at any stage you need a break, please say so, but there'll be breaks mid-morning and mid-afternoon in any event. Finally, please do keep your voice up for the record. That's so that the transcriber can capture everything you say and capture it accurately. And please don't nod, say yes or no, as the case may be.
Thank you.
Now, you have provided a report to the inquiry for the purposes of Phase 2. It's dated the 29th of January 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And the report relates to operational training and other matters. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, we can find your Phase 2 report at SMC *00046. And is that your report?
It is.
And can you confirm that the facts and matters set out in that report are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Thank you. And is it correct that you have provided the report in the same way that you would have provided an expert report to a court of law?
Yes.
Thank you. And does your report set out your opinions on the matters that are relevant to Phase 2 of this inquiry and which you have been asked to consider by the inquiry?
It does.
Thank you. And is it correct that your report does not address the management of fire survival guidance by control room operators, a matter which falls outside the scope of your expertise?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now that those matters are dealt with, can I briefly deal with your experience and qualifications? Now, you have set those matters out at paragraphs 6 to 14 of your report on pages 3 to 5, and at Appendix 1 of that report between pages 87 and 92. We don't need to go to them, but I'd like to draw out certain themes. First of all, is it right that you had a career in the fire service for some 39 years?
That's correct. Sorry.
And during which time you held operational roles, and during the last 2 decades of your service, senior leadership roles?
That's correct.
And you continue to work in an operational capacity throughout your 39 years in the service?
Yes.
And you have operational experience of working in several fire and rescue services and authorities, including the 3 largest metropolitan fire services outside London, namely Greater Manchester, West Midlands and South Yorkshire?
That's correct.
Your last 6 years of service were with the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, where you were the Chief Executive and County Fire Officer between 2009 and 2015.
Yes.
And before that, you were the Chief Fire Officer at Cheshire Fire and Rescue Service between 1999 and 2009.
Yes, that's correct.
And you were also a board member of the Chief Fire Officers Association, CFOA, for just under 10 years, from 1999 to 2008, and you acted as president of that organisation between 2006 and 2008.
Yes.
And is it right that you were awarded the Queen's Fire Service Medal in 2002?
That's correct.
And that you have been a Fellow of the Institute of Fire Engineers since 2004?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if we can just discuss, before we move on to the substance, the purpose and scope of your report for the inquiry. Now, your report sets out your opinion as to the matters relevant to operational firefighting that you consider fall to be considered in Phase 2 of the inquiry. Is that right?
That's correct.
And am I also right in understanding that those matters of operational firefighting that you've identified as being relevant come from 2 sources? First, the Phase 1 evidence on operational firefighting, and in particular the findings made in the Chairman's Phase 1 report.
That's correct.
And secondly, your own opinion on matters that you consider to be relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference and which were not explored in Phase 1 because they were outside the scope of that phase.
Yes.
Thank you. And you confirm in the introduction of your report at paragraph 19 that you agree with the conclusions of the Phase 1 report that concern the actions of the LFB on the 14th of June 2017.
That's correct.
And in particular, you agree with the finding that by 0130 hours at the earliest and 0150 hours at the latest, it was clear that reversing the stay put advice and attempting to embark on an evacuation of the tower was the only realistic way of minimising loss of life and serious injury.
I do, but I would also just wish to stress I would agree with the Chairman that that was not without risk and associated hazards as well.
And my next question was, and you also agree with the Chairman's finding that there were nonetheless substantial risks and formidable practical difficulties confronting an attempted evacuation.
I do.
Thank you. Now, the questions of operational firefighting that you address in the report are considered in 4 distinct parts, and these are set out at paragraph 21 of your report, which we can find at SMC /0006/7. And we can see at paragraph 21 towards the bottom of that page, we see point A, where the first matter you consider is the nature and scope of the London Fire Brigade's duty under Section 7.2D of the Fire and Rescue Services Act 2004, is that right?
That's correct.
And although that duty is probably well familiar to everyone listening now, that is the duty which in summary is imposed on fire and rescue services to obtain information for the purpose of effectively carrying out firefighting activities in their area, is that right?
That's correct.
And you have sought to understand the processes that the LFB had in place to collect and manage such information and the effectiveness of those measures.
Yes, I have.
As we see the second point, which is point B at the bottom of page 7, you considered the operational training of the LFB's personnel to the extent that this has not already been the subject of findings in the Phase 1 report. Is that right?
That's correct.
More specifically, you've considered 3 other matters. First of all, how a fire and rescue service may encourage the use of initiative amongst its operational personnel, whilst discouraging freelancing or unilateral action, the meaning of which we will come on to explore in due course. Is that right?
Yes.
Secondly, how a fire and rescue service may seek to implement effective instant command training for large-scale, high-rise fires, despite the general decline in live fires in recent years. Is that right?
That's correct.
And finally, the adequacy of LFB's instant command training.
Yes.
Thank you. And if we could turn over, which has already been done, to point C on page 8, you have addressed in the third part the effectiveness of some of the equipment used on the night of the fire, including aerial ladder platforms, ground monitors, positive pressure ventilation, and lightweight portable pumps. Is that right?
Yes.
And finally, the fourth section of your report, which is identified at point D on page 8, whether there are any alternative firefighting strategies which, in your view, could have been effectively used on the night of the fire. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, we will discuss those 4 topics in turn as we go through your evidence. And so the first one I'd like to turn to is the question of Section 7.2D. Now, first of all, can we look at the statutory background to that particular provision? My first question is this. Is it correct that before the 2004 Act came into force, the duty to collect information for firefighting purposes was found in Section 1.1D of the Fire Services Act 1947?
That's correct.
And we can see what Section 1.1D provided, because you set it out helpfully at paragraph 2 of your report, which can be found at SMC /000046/9. And we see there that Section 1.1D said this: it shall be the duty of every fire authority in Great Britain to make provision for firefighting purposes, and in particular, every fire authority shall secure, little d, efficient arrangements for obtaining, by inspection or otherwise, information required for firefighting purposes with respect to the character of the buildings and other property in the area of the fire authority, the available water supplies, and the means of access thereto, and other material local circumstances. Now, there is one source of guidance on the scope of that duty imposed under the 1947 Act, and you've identified that in your report, which you consider to be relevant, and that is the Fire Service Circular 16/1989. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, You deal with this matter at paragraph 3 of your report onwards, but it seems to me there are 6 points that are relevant arising out of that circular, and I'd like to go through them with you to see whether you agree.
Sure.
First of all, the decision as to whether premises should be visited by the local authority under 11D was a matter for that station, taking into account any relevant factors. Is that a fair summary?
A matter for that individual fire rescue service, which was then usually delegated to the station, but it's a matter for local determination, yes.
Thank you. And secondly, in terms of the nature of the inspection, brigades were encouraged to apply the test of whether basic firefighting techniques would be sufficient to cope with most of the incidents that could be envisaged at the premises. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary.
Thirdly, the frequency of inspections should be determined based on the particular circumstances of the premises, including matters such as any unusual building or construction features, any risk of rapid fire spread, and any high risk to life. Again, is that a fair summary?
It is.
Fourthly, and this looks at pre-planning, that was stated not to involve a great level of detail, and any plan should be readily accessible to the first attending crews and be in a standard format. Is that fair?
That's fair.
And you've stated that in practice, a hard copy card system was used at that time. Again, is that right?
Yes, it was, yes.
And specifically, the circular stated that the information should be kept to a minimum in order that it could be transmitted to crews by radio, and it referred to the information being, quotes, limited, and again in quotes, in most cases general in nature. Again, is that a fair summary?
It's fair. I suppose there are two purposes. It was limited because it was required for immediate use, and secondly because it would probably then be required to be passed by radio, so effectively the flip side of the same coin.
Now, 6 specific items were identified as being necessary to consider during 11D visits. First of all, occupancy and use of the premises, is that right?
That's right.
Secondly, access to and within the premises, is that
Yes.
right? Thirdly, structural features and the layout of premises, is that right?
Yes,
Fourthly, the presence of hazardous materials and processes, is that right?
that's correct.
And fifthly, firefighting resources and fixed installations.
That's correct.
And finally, power intake at the premises.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, the final 6th point I wanted to see whether you agreed with was this. Is it correct that brigades were encouraged to make use of 11D information during training exercises, and visits would be followed up with discussions and exercises on the application of the knowledge acquired during the visits?
That's correct.
Taking the step back, is it right to say that the circular encouraged a practical approach to the collection of information under 11D?
Yeah, very much so. It was intended for that first user, the first officer in charge. What information do I need in order to help me make an almost instant decision, certainly a very, very quick decision? And that was it, keeping it simple for that purpose.
And again, apologies if I put this crudely, they were focusing on the bare essentials that the first attending crew would require.
The bare essentials, absolutely.
And that the circular also actively encouraged active participation in 11D visits, including through training exercises and subsequent learning.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Now, as the title suggests, the 2004 the Fire and Rescue Services Act came into force, and it may be useful to look at the explanatory notes to that Act, which can be found at paragraph 14 of your report on page 12. Thank you. And it's at the bottom of that page. And the gloss that's provided on Section 7 says this. Section 7 reenacts the existing statutory duty for a fire and rescue authority to plan and provide arrangements for fighting fires and protecting life and property from fires within its area. A fire and rescue authority is required to secure the provision of sufficient personnel, services and equipment to deal with all normal circumstances, as well as adequate training. A fire and rescue authority must also put in place effective arrangements for receiving and responding to calls for help and for obtaining information which it needs to carry out its functions. The latter might include, for example, information about the nature and characteristics of buildings within the authority's area, or availability of and access to water supplies. That's a long run up to a simple question. Did FRSs alter the approach to information collection once the 2004 Act came into being?
Not substantially, no.
Thank you. Now, we've touched on this guidance with previous witnesses, but I'd now like to turn to Porous, which is the provision
I'm
of...
sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Clear. Mr. McGuirk, just help me with this. You've obviously had experience in a range of different fire and rescue services. Did anyone ever, as it were, stop to ask themselves, well, now, what sort of information do we need? Do we need any information that a crew wouldn't be able to gather from a visit?
Not really, Samantha. Essentially, there were a series of, if you like, disasters and also firefighter fatalities through the sort of 1990s and early 2000s. And if anything, each of those reinforced the need for simple information, accurate information, but simple information in order to assist the officer in charge to make rapid decisions at the point that they arrived. So if anything, probably the reverse is true, that you were discouraged from, as it were, exploring too far into alternative sources of information at that stage.
Right. Well, thank you, that's helpful. Yes.
So we'll be coming on to the approach adopted both in London and outside London in due course during Mr. McGuirk's
Yes, all
evidence.
right. Well, I'll be more patient.
As I said, we were coming on to discuss the Porous guidance, that's PORIS guidance, which was published in 2012. And if we could go and look at the screen which is in front of us, you deal and explain in the first sentence of paragraph 16 that in 2012 the government published what was the first substantive guidance document for the management of operational risk information since the 2004 Act had come into force, and that was Porous. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you suggest in the second sentence of paragraph 16 that the Porous guidance might have been prompted in part by a review by the Health and Safety Executive published in October 2010 relating to the management of operational health and safety by different fire and rescue services. Is that your assessment of the matter?
Yeah, that's a fair summary.
Now, we don't need to go into the detail of the review, but if I could just see whether you agree with certain headline points arising from it. Is it right that the review related to a series of inspections carried out into 8 fire and rescue services by the HSE following a number of firefighter fatalities at serious fires between 2000 and 2009?
That's correct, although there was no correlation between the fire services selected and the fatalities, i.e. it wasn't just the fire services that had firefighter fatalities that were selected for inspection.
Thank you. The inspections addressed a number of operational concerns, but one concern related to the provision of risk information, and the review found that some services did not have adequate systems to ensure the collection and dissemination of adequate risk information on relevant premises. Again, is that a fair, if high-level summary?
That's a fair summary.
And specifically, the review stated that in the majority of services, a need for additional training on the management of operational risk information was identified. Again,
that's correct.
Is that correct? And the review recommended the production of national guidance on the classification of risk premises and the collection and dissemination of risk information. Again, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, did the introduction of Porous mark a shift in the understanding of the duty and what it required under Section 72D?
I think it's fair to say it marked a shift in the requirement. Whether that marked a universal shift in understanding, I think, is a debatable point. At the time, it came out under what was called a bulletin, a fire and rescue service bulletin. Through that period of time, the way information was transmitted by the government, by the host department, took a variety of forms. And so the guidance came out under cover of a bulletin. There was no massive fanfare. There weren't a series of seminars or conferences to suggest this is a radical shift. And there was no requirement, in fact, for individual fire rescue authorities to adopt the guidance. And there was no inspectorate at the time, so I have no way of knowing how many actually did. And so it is true that many did, and it is true that it marked a shift in the requirement for collecting risk information, but I couldn't say that it was universally understood that that shift had been acknowledged and recognised.
Thank you. Now, the Porous guidance confirms that the primary aim of the collection of operational risk information continued to be the provision of timely and relevant information to operational crews. But you have explained in paragraph 18 of your report on page 14, and really I want to look at the first 2 sentences, that the key change that we should be focusing on is that the guidance introduced a much more sophisticated risk information management system. Is that the key point you want to emphasise here?
It is.
And the risk management system that the guidance set out was a 5-stage process, is that right?
That's correct.
And if we can go to page 45, sorry, I should say 45 of the Porous guidance, which is HOM 000 45 364/45. And here we have the first of the 5 stages set out. Now, the first 2 stages, which we're looking at on page 45, relate to the gathering of risk information either from Section 72D visit or some other source. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the guidance provides a template data capture fields, which are set out in Appendix C. And we can go to that in due course, but in broad terms, it's essentially a template for the type of document that fire and rescue services may wish to ask their station-based crews to complete when carrying out 72D visits. In broad terms, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, as I said, we can turn to Appendix C and that template, which, staying in this document, can be found at page 75, or starts at 75. Now, it's about 20 pages long, this template, is that right?
It is.
And it may be useful just so that we get a feel for the level of detail and the scope of the information that the appendix anticipated required to be collected if we go through it. If we go to page 77, now here we see that the form asks for information about the size of the building, the number of floors, and the floor area. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we can move on to page 78, we see that this deals with building status and whether any toxic or explosive substances are stored on site. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we go on to page 79. This deals with occupancy and suggests a very detailed breakdown on the face of it of occupancy and how this may vary throughout the day and during the week and weekend. Is that right?
It is, and that would recognise that different buildings have a very different profile. You know, London kind of empties at night and is full during the day, and the buildings accordingly. So that's why it's so varied.
And presumably that fire and rescue services ought to be aware of that variability during the course of the day.
During the course of the day and seasonally as well, you know, kind of coastal fire and rescue services would have differences during winter and summer.
Thank you. If we can turn over the page to page 80, we see that this relates to occupancy risks, and it includes taking account of those with restricted mobility. Is that right?
It is.
Thank you. And if we turn over the page to 81, we see that this concerns building systems, including internal communications, whether there is a control room, sprinklers, and the coverage provided by sprinklers. Is that right?
It is.
And if we go to page 82, this deals with more technical matters such as the drencher, gas, firefighting, and smoke control systems. Is that right?
It is.
If we go over the page to 83, this deals with automatic fire detection and escape routes as well as lighting. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we go over to 84, this deals with information about staff awareness of any emergency action plan, the standard of building maintenance, and building construction types and materials. Is that right?
It is.
And if we turn over the page to 85, we see that matters continue there, particularly in relation to construction type and materials. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we can see at the top of page 85 in particular that there's a reference to cladding, and the user is invited to tick which particular type of systems and construction materials are present. Is that right?
That's correct.
If we can turn over the page again to 86, this deals with matters relating to storage of large quantities of goods and or combustible materials. Is that right?
It is.
And we also see in the bottom half of page 86 water supplies, including flow and pressure rates, are set out, as well as details of the water provider. Is that right?
That's correct.
and even more detail is required on those matters at page 87, which includes information about any available open water supplies and the type of equipment that would be required at an incident, including the number of hose lengths. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we also see on page 87 a requirement for crews to collect information about security systems, the potential heritage or community loss in the event of an incident. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we turn over to page 88, crews are directed to collect information regarding any environmental risk posed by any substances on site. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we turn over the page and look at 89 through to 90, this directs crews to look at potential risks to firefighters posed by any of the physical features of the premises and or its immediate environment. Is that right?
That's correct.
And page 91, information regarding hazardous processes on site. Is that right?
Correct.
And then finally, page 92, information about access to the premises and operational resilience information is directed to be collected. Again, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, did Porous make it clear what was expected of fire and rescue services in relation to the collection of operational risk information, even if the guidance was demanding in what it required, particularly of fire and rescue services in major cities?
So we just take one step back. The reason why this is called a data capture form and is so comprehensive is it had emerged from a national project it's called the Fire Control Project, which was aborted, but whose goal was to increase interoperability between different fire and rescue services. And so ultimately, the ambition of this work when it was started was to enable data to be transmitted across different fire and rescue services, and so that they were all using the same data and using the same data capture. So this was a distillation, if you like, of the way best practice had developed, or different practice and different piece of information had developed in fire services over time. So in terms of the specific, when the documentation landed, it was a matter for individual fire and rescue services to determine how they would take the data capture form or the data capture information and use it for themselves. Many would already be using many of these fields, and for some of it wouldn't be applicable, but it was a matter for local determination how exactly you took the information, or you took the basis upon capturing the information for your own fire and rescue service.
But would it be fair or appropriate for the panel to treat this as a best practice summary?
Indeed it would, yeah.
Now, is it also a correct summary of your view that this data collection template is one of the principal ways in which the Porous guidance marked a shift from the previous approach to familiarisation visits?
Indeed, it was hugely more expansive than it had been the case previously. And I think the second point it's worth mentioning for the panel is that it was fusing together, if you will, 7.2D obligations, but also health and safety obligations for firefighter safety, the essence being to collect the information once, as it were, in order to be able to fulfil multiple purposes with it.
And does it flow from the scope and level of detail required by this template that crews would require further training in order to be able to identify and correctly collect the right information in order to discharge properly and effectively the 7.2D duty?
It brought with it a significant training implication from the previous. I think in my report there's a diagram, a sort of flow chart that shows what the new system looked like, and when you contrast that with a simple, need to know information aid memoir process of 1.1D and then morphing into 7.2D in the early stages, the contrast is stark.
Pushing my question slightly differently, without specific training, would a crew generally have the requisite knowledge and expertise to collect all the information that's relevant to them that's set out in this appendix?
I think in truth that would depend upon the fire and rescue service. In some fire and rescue services, firefighters had previously fulfilled more fire safety obligations and so would have a better awareness. In some fire rescue services, they were much more focused on a purely operational role for their fire and rescue crew. So I think it would be a mixed view, but certainly in some fire and rescue services, I would suggest probably the majority, training would be required in order to do justice to the totality of that data capture form.
Now, looking at whether it is or was appropriate to expect station-based operational crews to be managing this information. Is it your view that responsibility for managing risk information on a station's ground should remain with the local station-based crews rather than being delegated to, say, a more specialist department?
It is, for the purposes that it's required for an immediate operational response, and it's that familiarity that's ultimately its primary purpose.
But also that those crews need to be supported by clear guidance and comprehensive, consistent training as to how familiarisation visits should be conducted.
I would agree.
And actually following on from that, crucially, that crews needed to be supported by specialist advice from fire safety officers when needed, particularly when visiting more complex sites.
And I appreciate this is kind of in the context of Grenfell and high-rise building, but it's worth just making the point that's true for many other risks for which fire and rescue services have responsibility, hazardous materials. So the 7.2D would apply to sites like Bunsfield, for example, where you may need different expertise. But for the purposes of the inquiry in the panel, yes, in this case, it would be fire safety officers.
Looking at London specifically, is the need for specialist fire safety advice particularly so in the capital because of the relatively higher number of high-rise and/or complex buildings?
I would say that's probably equally applicable to cities around the country. So it's the nature of a city that you would get complexity in building construction and the features that represent a city, a transport network, whether it's an underground or a tram system. So the features of a city tend to bring with them complexity of building construction, a compact space trying to get buildings in. So you would tend to see more high-rise, and over time you would see more complexity associated with those high-rise. So I think it is true for London, and it's particularly acute in London, but I think it is also broadly true for the cities around the country as well.
And essentially, there needs to be regular and close liaison between fire safety officers and operational crews.
That's essential, and was also important on the 1.1D as well.
So that risk can be identified and addressed on the basis of an informed assessment of those risks.
I think you've got other experts talking about increased complexity. It's not just the risk being assessed and the crews being informed, but the practical mechanics of what they would need to do upon arrival with increasingly complicated systems of smoke ventilation, forced ventilation, air control systems, and so on. That when crews turn to some incredibly complex sites, that the actions that they need to take to in order to act safely and to be able to proceed with firefighting operations can actually be quite complex, and therefore requires the input from a fire safety officer to advise them really right from the start.
Would you anticipate that every high-rise building, residential building, is likely to require the contribution of a fire safety officer? Would only certain types of high-rise residential building require that contribution?
No, I think broadly speaking, high-rise buildings remain the same unless they're changed over time, unless a refurbishment, something like Grenfell. But over time, these things have been around, remember, since the 60s and 70s, and broadly speaking, the risks have remained the same, notwithstanding what the inquiry is looking at in terms of the tragedy of Grenfell. So there would be a degree of familiarity with the risks associated with the high-rise, and crews that have been experienced wouldn't usually or always need the contribution of a fire safety officer.
In what circumstances would you envisage that crews would require the assistance of a fire safety officer?
So I said there's two or three approaches to that. One, I would expect there to be some sampling anyway from the fire safety side of the equation to make sure that the crews remain on top of their knowledge and understanding in relationship to what they're looking for at a high-rise building. Secondly, in the event that there was what you might call local intelligence, so I mentioned in my report that the function of fire safety officers is to enforce the relevant legislation, and there are phenomena emerge as a consequence of trying to enforce that legislation. I cite as a footnote, I appreciate the inquiry is looking at fire doors in certain high-rise buildings. That would be a good example of a common phenomenon that crews should be minded to keep an eye open for when they're doing their 7.2D visits. So phenomenon that emerge from fire safety colleagues going about their business enforcing the relevant legislation, and where there was something that arose in particular that crews should have an eye to. If I give probably two examples to sort of illustrate the point.
Please do.
We'll think about balconies. Often these high-rise buildings have balconies, and quite often and over time people have done all kinds of strange things on their balconies. And certainly I've been to cannabis farms growing on balconies, or for example, we've just had some might argue we're still in a fuel crisis, and what some people might do is hoard fuel, and they would store it perhaps on a balcony. I've certainly seen that. So what the phenomenon of what's being experienced in terms of something like that, and again, it would often be fire safety officers or operational crews to which that gets drawn attention. You would expect fire safety officers to advise and perhaps coach in that regard. So balconies are another phenomenon. And the second one would be increasingly means of escape, and part of an ageing population. We've certainly seen an increasing use of mobility scooters and that kind of apparatus, and some real risks associated with some of those vehicles. They're kind of plastic, they've got batteries, and sometimes they can be stored in means of escape. So again, I'd expect fire safety officers to alert crews to some of those kind of risks, and assist on occasions to point out what they might do to mitigate that risk.
Thank you. Now, you identified two mechanisms there, sampling and local intelligence, in which fire safety officers may play a role. I just want to see nail something slightly more explicitly. Would you see fire safety officers having a role in identifying the types of buildings that ought to be the subject of a sampling exercise?
Yes, I would.
Thank you. Now, in your experience, do fire and rescue services provide the kind of specific and technical training that Porous Appendix appears to anticipate?
In some cases, they certainly do, yeah. Computer-based training, and fire safety officers going giving training to watches. I couldn't speak across the piece in terms of all fire and rescue services, but it certainly is the case that some definitely give that level of training.
What evidence have you seen about whether, and if so how, the LFB trained its crew managers and watch managers to identify the kind of technical information that Porous anticipates being collected?
Well, as I say in my report, Mr. Kinney, I haven't seen any evidence. I've seen one sort of PowerPoint slideshow, I think produced by Babcock's. I'm unclear whether that was indeed rolled out or the extent to which crews undertook that training. Notwithstanding that, I've not seen any evidence of any training at all.
And specifically, have you seen any evidence about whether crew or watch managers were trained to identify information about a building's cladding system, which was expressly referred to in Appendix C of Porous?
No, I've not seen evidence.
Going back to Porous itself and the next stage that's set out, and that's set out at page 51, which is at HOM 0004 5364/51. And we see there stage 3, which is detailed site risk analysis process. And the Porous guidance sets out a risk matrix in order to allow crews to complete stage 3 accurately, and that can be found at page 60. Thank you. Now, the matrix requires an assessment to be made of the likelihood of an incident occurring along with its severity. Is that right?
It is.
And the risk matrix then provides a risk score for the relevant premises. Is that right?
That's correct.
And guidance is provided in the matrix as to how an assessment of both those factors should be carried out, taking into account the information that has been gathered on a Section 72D visit. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we turn over the page to page 61, we see what is called a likelihood table, and that assists the user in determining whether a risk is probable, possible, unlikely, very unlikely, or negligible. Is that right?
It does, yes.
And is it correct that it is also your view that the introduction of this risk matrix was another important example of the Porous guidance marking a shift change from the previous approach to familiarisation visits?
Yes, significant shift.
And is that because of its more precise focus on the type of risk and the likelihood of that risk being realised?
It is, as well as its comprehensiveness and wider application.
Thank you. Can we now turn to and go back to page 54 in this document and find stage 4? Thank you. And this is entitled the risk management process. And this stage of the system itself uses the risk score that is given to the property in order to determine what level of risk management processes are appropriate. Is that a fair overview?
It is.
Now, looking at an example of its application, for properties that pose a very low risk, no further action may be required. For properties posing a higher risk, the Fire and Rescue Services may choose to require site-specific risk information or site-specific risk assessments as part of the information that is collected under Section 72D, and then that information is made available to first attending crews. Again, is that an accurate summary?
It is, yes.
Now, if we can move further to the final and fifth stage of the process, which can be found at page 58, and this governs the recording and dissemination of information that has been gathered. Is that right?
It is.
And in London's case, that is done via the Operational Risk Database, the ORD, which is the database on which risk information is recorded and then made available to responding crews. Is that right?
That's as I understand it, yes.
Now, we'll come on to the ORD in due course later, but could I sort of take the step back and attempt to summarise the Porous guidance, or the effect of the Porous guidance? And if we could go back for this purpose to your report, SMC *0046/15 and paragraph 21 and the third sentence. Now we see there, you say this in the third sentence. Porous now required operational personnel to shift from collecting relatively small amounts of information specific to firefighting to becoming more rounded risk assessors and to assemble and evaluate a much greater range of information. Having collected that information, crews must then carry out a more precise analysis to interpret the information collected and make qualitative judgments about the level of risk, applying a risk matrix. Does that remain your view?
It does, yes.
Did the introduction of Porous trigger a reassessment by Fire and Rescue Services of what was required in order to discharge at Section 72D? And in particular, did it trigger a reassessment by the LFB of its practices?
So I think on the general point, I think the honest answer would be it was mixed. Because it didn't come out under any kind of fanfare or any conferencing or announcements, different fire and rescue services picked up on it, I guess, dependent upon their individual circumstances and their own history. If they'd had serious fires or had firefighter fatalities, then they were probably more attuned to picking up on this. So I think in the general, it would have been a mixed picture. I think in terms of the LFB, I think the evidence suggests that it landed in the LFB quite clearly. I think in my report I talk about AC Brown. I think in his evidence he talked about a presentation he gave where he quite explicitly referred to the Porous guidance and an assessment that had taken place by the LFB of the extent to which their processes complied with the Porous guidance. So if anything, it probably landed better in the London Fire Brigade than it did in many other fire and rescue services at the time it was published.
Thank you. Now, following on from that answer, now what I want to turn to is the LFB's policies on the collection and management of operational risk information. Now, you've considered the LFB's policies and procedures on the management of operational risk, and these are addressed from paragraph 28 onwards in your report, which starts at page 17. Now, we will come back to what you say in your report, but I'd like to, for the first stage of questions on this point, look at the policies themselves. And the starting point for that exercise is policy 800, which is the management of operational risk. Now, in broad terms, policy 800 is the LFB's general management of operational risk policy, and it's not specific to any particular type of building. Is that right?
That's correct.
And policy 800 sets out the general processes by which station-based crews are expected to collect, assess and maintain risk information about properties in their areas. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in your view, I hope I summarise this correctly, is that on the whole the policy mirrored the 5-stage processes set out in Porous. Is that right?
Yes, it's very close.
Now, one specific point that you raise in relation to policy 800 is the role of the Fire Safety Department. and the fire and safety inspecting officers in 72D visits by operational crews. Now, you point out that Policy 800 recognises that fire safety inspecting officers may identify premises that require a visit, and they may also be best placed to provide assistance and specialist knowledge where this is required by the nature of the premises. Is that a fair summary of the point you want to draw out?
It is, yeah. And I suppose it was surprising given the long-standing link between the importance of fire safety information and its relationship to 11D previously and now 72D.
Thank you. And is it your view, following from that the LFB's policies and documented procedures, at least, are unclear as to how that information sharing process between fire safety and operational crews should take place?
I certainly found it circuitous. I had to kind of go backwards and forwards between the two documents. I recall the FSI GN 113, is it, and PN 784. I had to work my way between them to kind of figure out the route by which the information moved, or in theory moved. And
I think you draw out that point in the last two sentences of paragraph 29, where we can see.
Yes, indeed, sorry.
The penultimate word, the circuitous route. Now, looking at in more detail at the reasons for that view, one of the matters you identify, and this is set out at paragraph 29, which is in front of us, is policy 784, which is the LFB's notification of fire safety information policy. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, we don't need to go to that policy, but if people need the reference, it's LFB 000-12734. Is it correct that policy 784 is a short document that essentially directs fire safety inspecting officers to notify station-based personnel of any relevant fire safety information via a prescribed form?
It does.
And that on receipt, the station manager should decide what action needs to be taken in response?
That's correct.
And the same applies the other way around, so that station-based personnel, when they come across information that they consider should be seen by the fire safety officers, they use that system and a prescribed form to communicate that information.
Indeed, yeah, they point to each other.
Thank you. Have you found any specific guidance to operational crews about the kinds of premises or the particular issues that should be referred to fire safety for their more specialist view and assessment?
No, I've not. That's what was surprising. I mean, the theoretical link is there, but I couldn't see any evidence of where that had actually manifested itself in reality.
Now, the chairman touched on this in an earlier question to you, and we'll discuss Greater Manchester's experience in your time in due course. But in your experience, how common is it for FRSs to involve fire safety personnel in 72D visits and the management thereafter of operational risk information?
I would say it's pretty common. I mentioned earlier that the circumstances through history in terms of major incidents and firefighter fatalities had almost without exception, in fact probably without exception, drawn attention to a failure to collect or disseminate information under 11D, then 72D. So I think over many years, fire and rescue services had appreciated the significance of making sure, as far as they possibly could, that those links and the sources of information to get risk information to frontline crews were as solid as they could be. So I think it was a pretty common practice that fire safety officers would inform operational crews, and there would be a very strong link.
Looking at your particular experience in Manchester, the West Midlands and Cheshire, how effective was the collaboration between fire safety departments and operational crews?
I would say it was very effective. In fact, if I take one step before that, and I probably didn't detail too much in the CV, but I was a fire safety inspecting officer myself in Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service, and my patch, as it were, was Windsor and Eton and some of those areas. And I was very clear that part of my responsibility, if I found anything, was to bring it to the attention of the operational crews. I had a very clear responsibility to do that, and it was actively managed from within the hierarchy of the organisation. And I think it's true to say that followed through in all the fire and rescue services I worked in.
Looking at how it worked the other way, how proactive were crews in providing you, in your former role as a fire safety information officer, with information that they thought you needed to be aware of?
I would say that was much more mixed and much less of a strong link. I'd say prior to the regulatory reform order, many fire and rescue services had operational crews undertaking what they used to call Section 9A responsibilities, which were lower risk premises that still had a requirement to provide for fire safety arrangements, means of escape, and so on. And those lower risk premises inspections were often devolved to operational crews, and so there was a good awareness and a good relationship with the fire safety departments in the respective organisations that undertook those roles. When the regulatory reform order came in particular, those links, I think, started to dissipate because the knowledge of operational crews, the fire safety knowledge around some of the more technical aspects of fire safety management, dissipated over that period of time. So I think the links were good. I think the links weakened, I'd say, from 2005 onwards.
Why, do you think?
Well, I just said part of it was to do with the regulatory reform order and the fact that operational crews rarely now undertook fire safety inspections. I think Mr. Daly gave evidence the other day talking about a reintroduction of that in the LFB very recently, if not still going on. But I think the second was a shift of emphasis in terms of part of the role of fire and rescue services towards community fire safety. So operational firefighters were moved much more onto home safety assessment, community fire safety, that dimension of safety, if you will, rather than supporting regulatory enforcement.
Thank you. Mr. McGuirk, may I make a plea on behalf of the shorthand writer? I have to remind myself sometimes at the pace that I ask questions.
Sorry.
She has to capture everything, and if you wouldn't mind moderating the pace accordingly. Now, if we can go back to Policy 800 itself, am I right in saying that the policy also directs crews to take into account vulnerabilities of residents?
It does.
Now, if we can go to that policy, which is at LFB 000-83849/11, and look at paragraph 13.11. It's the very bottom of the page, there we have it. It says this: particular attention should be made to the following areas to ensure information on the ORD, Operational Risk Database, is correct. And then if we can look at little c, it says the number and vulnerability of persons within premises. Now, that is part of the information that should be taken into account when completing the premises risk assessment template. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, just to look at that point in slightly more detail, if we could go to that template, which is in this document, but at page 18. And if we see at the bottom of that page in section 3, is a part which gives guidance in relation to the occupancy specific information that the PRA, that's the premises risk assessment template, requires. And if we could just turn over the page to page 19, section 3 sets out in bullet point form a number of matters that crews are directed to consider. And we can see the fourth bullet point on page 19 is dependency of individuals, such as those using a medical facility, oxygen therapy, and so on, or with particular vulnerability related to age or condition, perhaps. Would you expect operational crews to collect that type of information about vulnerable residents from the building owner or manager when carrying out 7.2D visits? To a limited extent, I would suggest. And what is that extent?
I think where you were talking about high-rise building, a high-rise block of flats with occupants of all ages and abilities, I think you would anticipate collecting information about whether people with, for example, mobility issues were clustered or where they were located. Was there any attempt by the management organisation to locate those people at lower levels, for example, and were they clustered together? So I think in that kind of facility, that kind of premises, you would seek to collect as much of that information as possible in order to inform at least an awareness of the initial responding crews in the event of a fire, where the most vulnerable people were, in order to prioritise, if possible, rescue in that scenario. Where you would have wider premises, for example, a care home, you would anticipate effectively part of the fact that it's a 7-2 visit in the first place is probably because the majority of people in the home are vulnerable and have some impairment, visual or otherwise, or some form of disability. So you would probably make that assumption, and that would form part of your pre-planning in the event of an attendance anyway.
Thinking about the specific example of a high-rise residential building, does it flow from that answer that crews wouldn't necessarily ask for information about dependency of individuals who are using a medical facility?
I think on occasions they would, but I think there is a reality in that tenancies change very quickly.
If I can stop you there, what occasions would they ask for that specific type of information?
I think they'd ask for it on every occasion. I think their expectation about the quality and accuracy of the information they would get in return, if I'm frank, would be mixed. I'm not sure they would place any confidence that today that might be the case. In a week's time, the tendency could be completely different. So I think they would collect it, and it would be useful to record, and particularly things like oxygen, because they would have the effect of enhancing a fire in a particular flat or in a particular residency. But the extent to which they would bank on that information being accurate in the event of a real fire, I think would be very mixed.
Because essentially, I hope I put this fairly, could only be a snapshot at that particular...
It's current at the time you collected it, yes.
Now, finally, in relation to Policy 800, did that policy recognise the importance of involving the building owner and or the responsible person in the 7.2D process, in your view?
It didn't jump up, I think it's in there, but it didn't jump off the page at me as something that was considered an essential component. The whole thrust of 800 was a kind of very process-driven policy. Even the completion of the PRAs, very quantitative, quite mathematical, and I think I say in my report it's quite difficult to follow. It could be better laid out, but it didn't jump off the page that crews would automatically see this as a two-way exchange every time they undertook a 7.2D inspection.
If we can go to page 7 in this document and paragraph 7.21. And I think I'm right in saying this is the particular paragraph that we should be concerned with here. Now, have you seen any evidence about how involvement of the responsible person was secured as a matter of practice by the LFB and its crews carrying out 7.2D visits?
The only evidence I've seen is mention of key holders and the extent to which crews might be able to gain access if they anticipated access difficulties. But beyond that, I've not seen any evidence of extensive engagement with responsible people.
Thank you. Can we now put Policy 800 to one side and turn to Policy 633, which is the LFB's policy on high-rise firefighting, and in particular Appendix 1 of that policy. Now, the 633 can be found at LFB *0 1256. As became very familiar to everyone during Phase 1, this is the LFB's high-rise firefighting policy, and you've considered Appendix 1 of this document in particular, which sets out guidance as to the type of information that should be collected by LFB crews during 7.2D visits of high-rise properties in particular. And if we go to page 19 in this document, we find Appendix 1. And thereafter a list of 22 points, which we consider as part of the inquiry's Phase 1 investigations. Now, before we come on to the substance of that, just to get a practical steer from you, are you able to give us, even on a rough and ready basis, an indication of how long you would expect a crew to carry out a 7.2D visit of a high-rise residential building, if they were to consider each of the 22 points, or insofar as they are relevant to that particular building?
I would say at least a couple of hours, even with dividing your crew up to allocate different tasks to collect information, you'd be looking at least a couple of hours.
Now, do you think that this list of 22 items is appropriate in the sense that crews should consider each of those items when carrying out a visit?
Yes, I do.
Why do you consider that crews would have the relevant knowledge or indeed expertise to identify, for example, a particular cladding system?
Cladding systems, certainly insulated buildings and cladding systems have been a phenomenon affecting firefighting for quite a long time. I think the specifics of the particular system on at Grenfell probably is slightly different to that. The extent to which that was readily identifiable, I think, is a debatable point. But the phenomenon of buildings being clad or insulation being part of the phenomenon that firefighters should be minded to consider is not something especially new. And in fact, it's had an impact in firefighter fatalities over the years as well. So I think cladding is, and I think we heard evidence of that, in fact, that firefighters understood the dangers and risks associated with insulated cladding.
And when you say here, just looking at the evidence you gave, you said, I think the specifics of the particular system at Grenfell probably is slightly different to the extent that what readily identifiable, I think, is debatable. What do you mean by that? In more simple terms, why do you think it's debatable, first of all?
So I think some of the evidence was the insulated panels and insulated cladding panels, certainly those terms have kind of often got fused together, I think, during the inquiry. And I think, listening to the evidence of some of the firefighters are very aware of the risks associated with insulated panels, which are the types of panels used to insulate all manner of buildings, not just high-rise buildings. The insulated cladding panels, in a more recent phenomenon, used as it were as much to beautify buildings like Grenfell as they are for an environmental purpose, and I think remain a relatively new phenomenon. I think there is evidence in the LFB that they were well aware of the specific types of panel at Grenfell, particularly in the fire safety department. I'm sure she will come on to that. But the generalities of the risks associated with insulated panels and insulated buildings is something that would be familiar to firefighters more generally. Does that clarify it?
It does. I want to look at it, maybe if we can look at it slightly differently. I think I'm right in saying that there is although there's a reference to building construction features that may promote rapid or abnormal fire spread, and there's an example given of sandwich panels, there's no specific reference in this appendix to cladding systems per se, is there?
That's correct.
And that is to be contrasted with the fact that cladding systems are expressly referred to in GRA 3.2, is that right?
That's it, and this is to a degree GRA 3.2 transposed to the LFB's policy.
If we can just take it stage by stage, and if we can go to GRA 3.2, which is at LFB *0001255/18. Now this is GRA 3.2 itself, and if we can look at the fourth bullet point from the bottom of that list, we see that in the second line that expressly refers to cladding systems being something for which crews attending on 72D visits should be collecting information. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, apart from the omission or the specific omission of cladding systems in the appendix of 633, and this flows from an answer you gave earlier on, do you consider that Appendix 1 effectively supplements or implements Policy 800 and the implementation of the Porous guidance in LFB procedure?
Just say that again, Mr. Kinnear.
We know that cladding systems aren't expressly provided in Appendix 1.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding, is it your view that 633, the appendix, effectively is collecting the information that ought to be collected under 800 and the Porous guidance?
Yes, that's correct.
Now that, I think, has to be subject to a necessary caveat, and that is that the problem is that it would appear, based on the evidence that you reviewed, that neither 800 nor the additional guidance in Appendix 1 of Policy 633 is properly understood by operational personnel who are charged with carrying out these visits in practice. Is that a fair summary of the caveat you'd wish to bring to the panel's attention?
I would agree.
So what you're saying is that the documented policies are broadly appropriate, but implementation may not be as wholly effective as you'd want it to be.
Yeah, and I think I need to say quite that in the report, Mr. Kinnear. Yeah, I agree.
And in your view, is that likely to be because there is an insufficient understanding amongst operational personnel as to what is precisely required of them when they're carrying out 72D visits?
I think that's correct.
Would it also be fair to say that your view is the deficiencies in implementation were reflected in the poor quality of the information recorded on the ORD entry that was specific to Grenfell Tower?
Indeed, yes, very, very little information, which the Chairman pointed out.
And that we have the ORD, but I don't think we need to go to it. But, for example, there were no plans of the tower on the ORD, is that right?
No,
The number of floors was incorrectly recorded as 20, is that right?
that's correct.
There was no operational contingency plan included for the tower, is that right?
That's correct.
And the emergency contact details were incorrect or out of date.
As you understand it, yeah.
Now, you have stated that you agree with the findings of the Phase 1 report. To be clear, do you agree specifically with the finding in the Phase 1 report that the North Kensington crews who carried out these 72D visits at Grenfell could and should have taken steps to obtain information directly from the TMO in relation to the materials used in the cladding system?
Yes, I mean, that's part of the two-way exchange that you would anticipate crews having with responsible persons at the property.
And would you also agree with the finding that the crews should have obtained basic floor plans from the TMO, which showed flat numbers and basic layout?
Yeah. If not even a simple line drawing they could have done themselves, that is also acceptable. But the purpose is to get layouts of the floors, and there are a variety of means that you could seek to get that from, and the TMO would be the easiest of those.
Taking the step back, what evidence have you seen that crews were in fact trained on how best to carry out Section 72D visits by the LFB?
I've seen no evidence. Essentially, my sense of it is that the crews may well have been following a much more extensive procedure, but culturally, they did not really see it as being very different to a 11D that they'd already done. If you like, it was a computerised 11D, I think would be the way to characterise it from the crew's point of view. That would be my sense of it.
Thank you. So, with less than immaculate timing, and it's slightly earlier than we'd otherwise be the case, it may be best to take the mid-morning break now, simply because the next topic I won't be completing within 5 or 10 minutes.
Yes, all right. Well, Mr. McGuirk, as you were told, we have a break during the course of the morning. Normally it comes a little later than this, but it's obviously convenient to take it now. So we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 25 past 11. And I have to ask you, while you're out of the room, please, not to discuss your evidence or anything relating to it.
Thanks, sir.
All right. Would you like to go to the usher, please? Thank you. Right, 25 past 11. Then.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Would you ask Mr. McGuirk to come back in, please? All right, Mr. McGuirk, you ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear?
Sir, thank you. Mr. McGuirk, in earlier evidence, we touched upon the experience of discharging Section 72D in other fire and rescue services, and it's that topic I'd like to come on to now. The key question arising from the evidence in the Contingency report is this: is the effective and consistent management of operational risk information a challenge for fire and rescue services in this country?
It is generally, yeah.
Why?
So I cite four reasons in the report. One of them is that firefighting is very much a full contact activity. It appeals to people who like a physical career. There are lots of skills to be acquired, lots of technical knowledge to be assimilated. Fundamentally, it is about applying those skills and knowledge in an operational setting. And so I wouldn't say there's an aversion to paperwork, but there's certainly an aversion to bureaucracy, if you will, and it really is very difficult to get rigorous, if you like, administrative systems in place, given the volume of bureaucracy that increasingly has been applied to fire and rescue services. So there's something about the paperwork and the bureaucracy that really is a kind of constant struggle. And I think the introduction of 72D and Porous added further layers to the requirements to produce comprehensive documentation, premises risk assessments, and so on.
How do you deal with that problem? How do you resolve that tension then?
So the two, culture and training, I think, are the two things. I think the first thing you have to do is to be clear about your values as an organisation, that as a fire and rescue service, as it were, we're a life or death service, so rigour in the way we go about everything that we do needs to be a core value.
If I can stop you on that.
Sure.
In your experience as a chief fire officer, how do you go about establishing, in practical terms, the right culture? Because it's an easy phrase to use, but how do you go about, in practical terms, achieving that appropriate culture?
So it's a combination. It starts right from kind of basic training, where there's a rigour and an expectation of self-discipline amongst people who join the fire and rescue service, as well as it being. When I say disciplined environment, it is not the sort of jumping up and down kind of environment that people might foresee or envisage. Nevertheless, there does need to be a sense of rigour and discipline and order to the way fire and rescue services go about doing things, because it's a hazardous occupation. And so constantly making sure that from day one in the recruits course, the tone with which the organisation communicates with staff is the right tone. And in my view, that needs to be kind of straightforwardness is key, not dancing around imprecise language or sort of dancing around in a pinhead with some potentially difficult areas, being very clear and straightforward what the expectations are of personnel, not just from the organisation, but because the community services that we fulfil. So getting personnel focused on what it is about being a firefighter and what it is about being a modern firefighter, which is beyond just the pure operational dimension, and effectively continually living up to those expectations from the top of the organisation to the very bottom of the organisation.
Thank you. And flowing from that, presumably flows the second point you were going to make, which was in relation to training.
In relation to two things, Mr. Kinnear: training and clear and straightforward policy frameworks. What exactly is it that we expect of people across a wide range of areas, which will come as no surprise, are very significant indeed, and supporting people to ensure that they understand what those expectations and requirements are through effective and high quality training.
Thank you.
I mean, we could talk all day about culture, but in summary, I think that's really a reasonable stab.
Thank you. Now, if I can just take a step back and put some background on your conclusion that there was a challenge for achieving the effective and consistent management of operational risk information across all FRSs. And could we go to the Inspectorate's 2019 State of the Fire Service report, which you refer to in your own report,
Sure.
paragraph 65. Now, am I right that Inspectorate report raised the concern that in some of the services inspected in 2019, the risk information being relied upon was inaccurate or missing? Is that a fair summary?
That's correct.
And Am I right in understanding that a similar concern was noted in the Scottish Inspectorate's 2019 report?
It was.
And dealt with more specifically, the Scottish report found that station-based staff reported making only limited use of risk information collected on their database, in part because the information can often be inaccurate. Again, is that a fair summary of your take of the Scottish?
It is, and in many ways, you mentioned the 2010 Health and Safety Thematic Review that was probably the trigger for Porous. In many respects, they read very similarly.
I was about to ask you the question. It seems that the underlying problem seems to remain between 2010 and 2019, and Porous hasn't altered matters to the better.
It doesn't appear to have made a significant difference to the understanding of operational personnel about the value and importance of risk information.
Again, apologies, may retread on previous answers, but from your particular perspective and based on your experience, what is your assessment of the reason why Porous hasn't achieved the step change it was clearly seeking to do?
In my view, I think that the essential problem is that there's nothing wrong with Porous per se, because the totality of information required is required for one legitimate reason or another. The problem with it is when you try and fuse it all together, it's a heck of a lot of information for people to try to get their head around in terms of collecting it. But it loses its sense of what it's there for, which is coming back to the original intent of 11D, nay 72D, to be available to the initial officers in charge to make quick decisions and what information do they need to do that. And I think that in collecting this wide range of information, traction has been lost on that focus of its original intended purpose.
And so it's the weight of the information rather than the nature of the information itself that is recommended to be collected that's the problem.
It's the weight and the clarity of purpose of the information, I would suggest. It's not always clear that this will enhance the operational need at the scene of an incident.
Following on from that answer, which aspects of the information that Porous recommends be collected do you think is less obviously useful for the operational response?
So it's not so much items of information, it's the question of the use. So essentially, there are two major functions that the operation would fulfil. The first is to assist the officer in charge to make a decision about what tactics to deploy at this incident confronting us in the here and now. And the second purpose would be to inform a dynamic risk assessment in terms of the many and varied hazards and risks associated with these circumstances. And so, particularly for incident commanders, I think they can get confused in what exactly am I doing? What am I using this information for? Am I doing a dynamic risk assessment or am I following my plan of attack? I think Dr. Grimwood's evidence was really interesting when he talked about the simplicity of a mnemonic that gives people a kind of quick and ready reference point just to organise their thinking in the here and now. And I think to a degree, Dr. Cohen-Hatton would have supported that with some of their models, which we may come on to talk about later. But I think it's that volume of information, it is all going to be required at some point in time during the gestation of an operational incident. It's been really clear what do you need in the here and now to make a quick decision about the tactics you're going to deploy now, and what do you need then to inform a dynamic risk assessment. And it's probably the same information. It's a question of being intellectually able to use it at the right time.
Thank you. Now, there are a number of specific practices that you've identified in your report, drawing upon reports that you've seen from West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Services. These are considered from paragraph 69 of your report onwards, which is SMC 00046/31. I'd like to discuss just three of those with you. Now, the first point you raise is the concept of a thematic approach to 72D visits, which involves different crews being given responsibility for visiting different types of building on their station's ground. So, for example, the same crew may be asked to visit all hospitals in their area. What do you see as being the merits and the disadvantages of that thematic approach?
So I think the merits, as I touched upon them in the report, are that different risks require more in-depth consideration than other risks, and it's really helpful for firefighters to be able to develop just that next layer down of expertise in a particular thematic area, informed by a specialist fire safety officer, and they can then kind of communicate that to colleagues on the watch, and they can pass that information across the station, and over time you get a much better awareness across the whole station of the nuances associated with different themes and different tactics and different operational problems. I suppose the only disadvantage I can see is the risk that as personnel change and there's a churn of personnel, that sometimes it's entirely possible that a particular crew may turn up to a particular risk, and just the way the chronology of the order of themes have been taken, this might not be as quite familiar from the topic point of view as it would be to another crew that had specialised in this area. But I think that's a risk of 7.2D anyway. You know, in the end, the fallback remains the general level of knowledge they would have about that particular incident anyway.
And would it be fair to say that in addition to the acquisition of a degree of expertise, thematic approach would also produce a greater degree of consistency of approach to particular risks presented by particular types of buildings?
You would anticipate that, but I think the question of consistency also comes down to the role of the local station manager in terms of making sure that the administration of the process and the quality control is done at that local level as well.
Thank you. Now, the second practice that emerges from your report, and you deal with this at paragraph 75, which is on page 33, is the involvement of fire safety personnel, and specifically the mandatory requirement in Greater Manchester that certain types of buildings, including high-rises over 6 stories, are subject to joint inspections by operational and fire safety personnel acting together. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of that degree of collaboration?
So I think that the two obvious advantages, one is that the crews develop a better awareness of matters such as the principles of compartmentation and the fire safety features, the passive and active fire safety features of buildings, and their awareness of the implications of, as it were, design failures or breakdowns becomes much better. In terms of disadvantages, I'm not sure really there are any disadvantages at all. I think it's a pretty vital component.
And the requirement in Manchester, am I right in saying it applies to all buildings above 6 stories?
Certainly that was our policy, and I assume remains the policy today.
And so, given that there's no attempt to differentiate between high-rise buildings that require specific fire safety advice and those that do not, is it assumed that all buildings over 6 stories would benefit nonetheless from a fire safety contribution?
Yes, it is, and driven as much by incidents of firefighter fatalities in high-rise buildings as well as public safety issues. There's a twin-track approach to that.
Now, the third practice you identified in the report is the practice of designating a nominated fire safety officer for each operational watch. And the role is to act as a single point of contact for any fire safety issues or inquiries that the operational crew may raise. Is that a fair summary of the
It is.
Again, what are the competing advantages and disadvantages of that particular approach?
So if I do the disadvantages first, you can have churn amongst fire safety officers, and maintaining a continuity on that fire safety side of the equation can be difficult. So there are some challenges in that respect. But again, the advantages, I think, are self-evident, that you get an officer who's got the latest and most current thinking of building design, building construction, as well as the point I made earlier, which is an understanding of local intelligence about what's going wrong around the area, are there any issues that crews should be aware of, in a very localised way, because sometimes these can be very, very specific issues to a particular area and may only be of a short-term duration. They may not be something that's a feature for a long period of time. So you also get a sense of immediacy as well as the sort of longer-term awareness of some of the risks associated.
In your review of these matters, did you sense that there'd been an improvement in the efficacy and effectiveness of the exchange of information between fire safety and operational crews as a result of adopting this sort of single point of contact model?
It's difficult to say, to be honest. I mean, I think the extent to which you could measure efficacy of information is only in the actuality of were incidents, as it were, better dealt with after and before, and I'm not sure we've got any basis upon which to judge that, really.
But I suppose, put differently, there's no evidence that it caused any harm.
I was going to say, logic would suggest it certainly couldn't do any harm, and you would assume that it would make a big improvement. Certainly, familiarisation with principles like compartmentation and some of those phenomena. Other witnesses have talked about some of the effects associated with how wind-driven fires, some of these effects were also able to be debated at that operational level. So awareness generally was raised.
Am I right in reading your report that the three approaches you've identified in your report could be usefully combined? Put differently, they're not mutually exclusive.
Indeed not, and I suspect West Yorkshire do something similar as well. No, I think you'll find a lot of fire rescue services look at the situation in the round.
Thank you. Mr. McGuirk, I now want to turn to the significant subject of training. You address training from paragraph 81 onwards of your report, which can be found at page 35. And there are two primary subtopics within this area which you've considered. First of all, the balance to be struck between the need to ensure order and discipline on the fire ground, whilst at the same time allowing for and encouraging operational personnel to use their initiative and to adapt to the particular circumstances of the fire, and how training can achieve that balance. And secondly, incident command training, and in particular the challenge that is posed by the relatively recent decline in real live fires, which has led to more limited opportunities for personnel to gain experience of a command role dealing with a live fire. And those are the two principal points of your concentration, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Now, first of all, can we start with this difficult topic of initiative and the phenomenon of freelancing? Now, you've used the term freelancing in your report, which we can see there at the header just above paragraph 84. Now, you use it to describe behaviour by operational personnel that can occur where there is a breakdown of control or leadership on the fire ground. As an entry definition, is that a fair point to start at?
It is, and I think it's lifted from the National Operational Guidance, actually.
Thank you. And that's when, put differently, personnel unilaterally decide to take a particular course of action, acting on their own accord, and without the direction, supervision, or sometimes knowledge of the commanding officer. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, this issue was identified by the chairman in the Phase 1 report, and we'll come on to examples of the type of conduct that he had in mind as identified in the report in due course. The specific difficulty that you identify is that this kind of unilateral action must be avoided because of the risks it poses. What risks does this type of action present?
So I think it poses risks to the general public, in that where an individual or individuals are, as it were, freelancing, they are not available to the officer in charge to commit to delivering the tactical plan that he or she has got in mind. And because they are unaware of the act of freelancing, they can make assumptions when forming that tactical plan that means that then the plan cannot be enacted, and that can have really significant impacts on public safety and the delivery of the plan. From a firefighter safety point of view, similarly, if you, as it were, lose track of people, you don't know where they are, they're moving into a kind of freelancing space, then if anything were to happen to them, you've no knowledge of that, you've got a firefighter emergency without realising it, and then at the point in time that you did realise it, then you would then have to commit and divert resources from what you were using them for in the first instance, i.e. to deal with the incident, to try to rescue said firefighter who has been freelancing.
Am I right that your view is that the answer is not, however, to insist upon rigid automatic adherence to procedure at all costs?
Quite the reverse. I mean, the reality is that there's no, I use the expression, no two fires are alike, and there's a paragraph I use there to explain the complexity. There is no perfect or no model fire. You can construct model fires in laboratories and for experimentation purposes, but in the real world, fires have many variables. And so I think that's a very accurate sentence. No two fires are alike. And for that reason, they will unpredictably behave, and there will be knock-on implications that are entirely unpredictable. And you really need firefighters to be intelligent, to be able to use their initiative, to have the knowledge of what to do, and effectively to stitch together the most workable solution, the most workable approach to the situation that they've got in front of them. And two people may actually see the same situation differently and actually approach it differently. That doesn't mean to say they couldn't both equally come to the same successful outcome. There is no ordered outcome that's preordained at an operational incident.
It's easy to identify that a balance needs to be struck between initiative on the one hand and adherence to policy and orders on the other. Given your 4 decades worth of experience, how does, in practical terms, the incident commander strike that balance?
Training is a vital component of that. I think you heard from Dr. Cohen-Hatton about the various decision-making models. I don't know whether we're going to kind of come on to that, but I think it's relevant here that reflexively and intuitively, when confronted with a situation, commanders will draw on the bank of experience that they've got, whether that's operational experience or in some cases whether it's training. And it's not to say that experience is directly applicable to this situation, hence the decision control process that was described to the panel. There's a need to kind of pause and reflect and not just see this situation. It might look a lot like a situation of experience previously. That doesn't mean it is exactly the same. So you've always got to be guarded about that. And that requires both experience and training for people to understand the risk of operating reflexively. And so you've then got to give people an awful lot of training, as much as anything, to coach them out of that reflexive reaction, that intuitive reaction, having to make an instinctive and instant decision. But by the same token, they're still going to have to make a swift decision and develop a plan of action and enact that. And so that combination of experience and debriefing and learning from experience and coaching and feeding back at the same time as training and assessment as part of that training and correcting where people have got it wrong and supporting them where they've got it right. You put those two things together and I think that's the closest you're going to come to the giving people a position of being able to see a situation in front of them and stitch together, and I use that expression very deliberately, they're going to have to stitch together various policies, various standard operating procedures to get the best fit for the situation that they've got in front of them.
Thank you. And although it's easy to focus on the incident commander striking that balance, does the balance between initiative on the one hand and compliance with orders and policy on the other, is that something that needs to be struck at all levels of the operational response, or is it confined to the incident commander?
No, quite the reverse. It absolutely needs to be at all levels. I think particularly when crews are in breathing apparatus, because they really are on their own in a very isolated position. When there are two people inside of a team of two, one will be a team leader and the other will be a team member. There may be more members of a team in certain circumstances, but typically it will be two. And they're in a smoke-filled, hot building, and they've got to act on their own initiative and, as it were, do the best that they possibly can in those circumstances. And in order to do that, they need to be confident, they need to be well-trained, they need to have the necessary knowledge, and again, they need to be able to adapt to the circumstances that confront them in the here and now.
Now, obviously, the striking of this balance needs to be risk-sensitive at all stages. What risks do you think the incident commander needs to be alive to be sensitive to when seeking to strike this balance?
Could you perhaps just rephrase that, Mr. Kinnear?
Striking the balance
that
we've discussed requires the incident commander to be sensitive to the risks that flow from particular actions or inactions. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
What risk does he have to be aware of?
So he or she is constantly balancing the risks to the public of a course of action when weighed against the risks to firefighters by taking that course of action. So he or she has to have sufficient knowledge to be able to evaluate what are the likely outcomes of alternative courses of action, and they're weighing in the balance those risks. And if their view is, in a very short space of time, that the risks of taking action in terms of safety of the public outweigh the risks that firefighters would need to take to implement that plan, then they would implement that plan.
And so it's going to be a combination of experience, training and technical knowledge that will inform that assessment of risk. Is that fair?
It is.
Thank you. Now, in your report, you look at various examples of initiative, or as it's put differently, freelancing. And if we can examine two examples that you've set out in your report to look at the advantages and disadvantages of that type of unilateral action. Now, the first example I'd like to look at is the rescue of 2 residents from floor 9 of the tower by crew manager Tillerson and his crew. And you address this at paragraph 89 of your report, which can be found at page 37. Now, you've set out a lot of detail in that paragraph, but could I try and summarise it more pithily this way? First of all, as to the facts, the crew were not given a briefing at the bridgehead, but crew manager Tillerson decided that they would go up the tower and start clearing the floors. That's to say, looking for residents who might be in need of assistance. Is that right?
That's right.
Importantly, crew manager Tillerson informed the bridgehead commander that that is what he was intending to do. Is that right?
That's correct.
And crew manager Tillerson decided that his crew would not take firefighting equipment with them because he thought it would slow them down. But that decision was against standard procedure. Is that right?
It was. And that's part of his dynamic risk assessment as well.
Thank you. And when the crew located 2 residents in a flat on floor 9, it was decided that 3 of the crew would go back down to the bridgehead to collect BA sets for them, that's breathing apparatus sets for them, due to concerns about smoke logging in the stairwell. Again, is that a rough and ready summary?
It is.
And the other 2 members of the crew would stay with the residents in the flat. Now, that decision, is it again correct to say that that was against standard operating procedure?
It was, yes.
The 2 residents were, however, safely brought back down and out of the tower using this method. Again, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, is it your view that the Tillerson mission demonstrated an effective and appropriate way of adapting to the particular circumstances confronting the crew and in a way that was acceptable?
I think I call it professional risk-taking, but yeah, I would agree.
And can you amplify your reasons as to why you think this is a useful example of initiative?
So I think crew manager Tillerson realised the risks associated. He absolutely knew he was in breach of procedure, as it were, but he could see the situation in front of him and understood the capabilities of the crew of people he had with him, and effectively made a dynamic risk assessment on the spot, weighing in the balance those principles I mentioned earlier. That is to say, the risk to the public vis-a-vis the risk to firefighters, and on balance believed that it was a risk worth taking, and therefore decided to do so. To decide to kind of take the plan of action that he did. In doing so, he didn't just go, as it were, UDI. He connected with the bridgehead commander, watch manager O'Keefe, who was aware of what he was doing. You've touched upon radio communications. The extent to which he would have been in communication would have been a debatable point on the night. Nevertheless, he took his crew and fulfilled that task and successfully managed to rescue the residents.
And it's just to draw out that point, a key element of this is that he notified the bridgehead commander what he was doing and where he was going.
Indeed, yeah. He wasn't asking permission to do that. He was seeking agreement and informing the bridgehead commander, who sensibly supported him to undertake that task.
Sorry, can you just go a bit further on that? I mean, as I read your account and recall what happened, Tillerson took the initiative only in the sense that he could see a possible use for his crew, but he got approval from the bridgehead commander, which was O'Keefe. Is that right? So in a way, he wasn't, as it were, using his own initiative other than to suggest a particular deployment for a crew which was there and then available for whatever use was required.
So I think there's 2 dimensions to that, sir. Firstly, whether he was seeking the permission of Mr. O'Keefe or whether he was informing him, I think I'd have to go back and read in detail the witness testimony. My sense of it, certainly from reading, was that he was informing Watch Manager O'Keefe rather than seeking his permission. But the second aspect of initiative was the decision to break the team up and to keep two members. You would normally keep the team together. So the decision to break the team up and keep two members to reassure the residents, to send people back down and get breathing apparatus sets, and then to bring everybody down together, I thought was also, as it were, a second example of good use of initiative.
I mean, I think what I'd really welcome your thoughts on is whether it is desirable for a crew manager with, 3 other people, possibly 4, depending on the size of his crew, to decide how to deploy his crew rather than to obtain instructions from someone more senior about how to deploy his crew.
I think the latter is preferable. If there is a clear tactical plan that is informed to the crews on the fireground, I don't think there was a clear plan that people were following at Grenfell, and therefore crews like crew manager Tillerson were improvising on the night. That's fair to say. I make that point quite a lot during the report. And so it's a fine line, isn't it? In preference, if there's a real clear tactical plan, then you would hope and anticipate that crews would follow that plan. But in the absence of a plan, as we saw on the night of Grenfell, what you wouldn't want them to do is to, as it were, sit tight and just allow circumstances to unfold without really doing anything. It's a difficult dilemma. I don't think it's a paradox. I don't think there is a correct solution to that challenge, sir.
Well, thank you.
So,
Yes.
flowing on from your question, there are 2 respects you've identified in the report in which Crew Manager Tillerson departed from policy. One was not taking firefighting kit with him as they went up the tower. The second was effectively splitting up the crew, and as some came down and 2 remained in the flat. To what extent do the LFB's policies and procedures identify, permit or encourage personnel to exercise their own judgement and initiative in the way that Crew Manager Tillerson did?
So I mentioned the general point about operational discretion. So the LFB have, within their policy on dynamic risk assessment, they have, as it were, a sub-policy called operational discretion, where in the event that local commanders face a situation for which there is no standard procedure, for which there is no agreed operating procedure, then they are at liberty to step outside procedure and to take whatever action is necessary, particularly where it's possible to save life. They would seek to, and that's a general policy across all fire and rescue services now, operational discretion, but it's set out in the LFB's policy. I would add there are quite a lot of caveats on the way the London Fire Brigade write up that policy, and I couldn't say it's a policy I think has been used extensively, but I think the policy framework is there for local commanders to make a local decision determined by the circumstances in front of them.
We'll come on to operational discretion in due course, but I want to pick up at that point what the parameters, what the confines, the limits of operational discretion are, but we'll come on to that in due course. Flowing from your answer, does the training of the LFB's operational personnel sufficiently equip them to identify where they need to use operational discretion and how best to exercise it safely and effectively?
I would say not on the basis of the evidence I've seen, Mr. Kinnear.
I think you amplify that answer.
Yeah, I think the act of outsourcing training is a matter for the London Fire Brigade. I think the consequence of it is that for a supplier to provide training against some kind of a specification, then the client needs to set out that specification, and there needs to be a sort of rigidity, a procedural dimension. You can only kind of hold somebody to a contract if it's clear what's contained within the contract. So it struck me that over time what evolved was training to a policy, In particular, I think there were 3 policies, which were the incident command system, dynamic risk assessment, and the decision-making model. So I think officers were trained to apply those policies and models. That is not the same as being able to develop a tactical plan to extinguish this fire or to deal with these circumstances. And so I think the LFB were in the former space, that is, training an awful lot against policies and policy frameworks, with conformity to policy being the goal, rather than necessarily resolutions to incidents.
That sounds like an unduly prescriptive model of training as opposed to a lax model of prescription of training. Do you follow my... You were warning against the dangers of the requirement for the LFB to prescribe what they want from training, and your answer, which focused on training personnel to policy, tends to suggest the dangers of an unduly prescriptive or limited training policy.
So yes, I agree, Mr. Kerr. Yeah. So effectively, they may well have people who can follow the policy, but that assumes that the policy is correct to start off with, and it's not been tested.
How do you strike the balance? Because obviously firefighters need to know the policy, and incident commanders need to know the policy. But how do you train them to understand how best to exercise operational discretion safely and effectively?
So I think you have to do a blended approach to training. Some of it some of it straightforward teaching of policy, procedure, what is the right way to extinguish this fire, to use water in this way, and so on. So there is definitely a component of technical knowledge that is teaching. There's a need then to have a blended approach to training and exercising. So some simulation is extremely useful in some scenarios. The case study work and working through incidents, and then at break points, talking through the implications. Some of these very real incidents, debriefing very real incidents. Some of them, training exercises for which you would then use injects, all the way up to smaller scale exercises and all the way up to larger scale exercises where people actually take command. And in truth, it is only at those larger end of exercises, I appreciate there's been a debate about where on the continuum of training is the best place to fall. And I don't think there is one or the other. I think all are required. Some of the evidence that the inquiry has heard just yesterday about communications, you can't test communications in a simulated exercise. The communications never breaks down in a simulated exercise because you've got avatars and somebody doing an inject, and it's all prescripted, it's all running to a script. So comms don't break down in the middle of a simulated exercise. If you have a 20, 30 pump exercise in the basement and in the London Underground, for example, and there's lots of people using comms for real, they've actually got the leaky feeders out and you figure out they're not working, they're breaking down. It is only when you get to that end of testing the reality of the kit and equipment in the real world that you can also tease out learning from that. So essentially, Mr. Kinnear, it's a very blended exercise. There isn't one or the other. It's tabletop, it's simulation, it's exercises, it's input, and at the end of it, a degree of assessment of competence so that you can give people feedback where they've got development needs.
Thank you. We'll come on to some of the elements of that particular index in due course. Can we turn back now to the second example of initiative that you identified in your report, and that was the actions of firefighter O'Byrne, and we can see that you deal with this on paragraph 90 of your report, which is up on the screen at the moment. Again, can I see if I can summarise the relevant facts thus. Firefighter O'Byrne had assisted with preparing the hoses used by the first crews who entered flat 16, and once he had done that, he started to go up the tower to see what conditions were like. Is that right?
That's correct.
Importantly, Firefighter O'Byrne did not inform the bridgehead or anyone else of what he was doing or where he was going. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that absence of communicating what he was doing was in breach of expectations or procedure, is that right?
It is.
And Firefighter O'Byrne also didn't wear breathing apparatus. Again, that would be outside procedure, is that right?
In this situation, I'd say, I wouldn't say it's always outside of procedure, but he was at the supporting the crews going in. So I would say on this occasion, yes.
And on reaching some of the higher floors and encountering smoke and residents who were attempting to leave, he was unable to make radio contact with the incident commander. Is that right?
That's what the evidence suggests, yes.
Now, your view, and please shout if I've summarised this too crudely, is that firefighter O'Byrne's actions, whilst well-intentioned, amounted to freelancing.
That's correct.
And which posed a number of risks. Is that right?
Indeed.
Yeah. Now, can you identify the panel what risks were caused by this type of action?
So to a degree, I think we can touch upon this earlier, that the officer in charge, and at a crucial time when this incident was turning and the external fire was accelerating, effectively, and resources were always going to be tight, there was an important resource lost to the incident commander, who assumed he would have that resource at his disposal. I think the second risk is, as firefighter O'Byrne was going up the tower, he had a lot of rich information about what was happening inside of the tower, and that information would have been incredibly useful to Watch Manager Dowden had he been aware of it. And I suppose the third aspect is that in the event that anything would have happened to firefighter O'Byrne, that would have created a firefighter emergency. And at that time, in particular, it was a pivotal period of the incident, wasn't it? The fire had breached compartmentation, and effectively, if I can use the expression, the fire was really starting to motor, and there was a real kind of sense of we need to start committing crews and doing something here. And if at that point in time, firefighter O'Byrne had gone missing, then it would have made Watch Manager Dowden's job even harder than it already was, because he would have had a dilemma. Do I commit crews now to search for firefighter O'Byrne, or do I start to try and tackle the fire? I mean, Watch Manager Dowden had enough of a challenge on his plate as it was. That would have been a real difficult, even more difficult crisis facing Watch Manager Dowden.
Now, I think it's important to note and make this clear that in your report, your view is that the firefighter took the action he did out of a sense of duty and effort. Is that right?
Indeed. As I say, I think it was a well-intended action. He thought he was going to find out information that he could add value to the incident.
And that he went on to fulfil several valuable roles later on in the incident time.
Indeed he did.
Does it necessarily follow from what you've concluded that you're not doubting the firefighter's good intentions, but you identified this example as an illustration of defects in training?
Yes, I think that's fair, Mr. Kinnear.
Now, we've touched on this in earlier questioning, but could I now turn to the solution to the problem, and again talk in slightly more detail of the matters we've been canvassing during the course of the morning. Now, I think I'm right in saying the principal element of the solution is training, as you've referred to in earlier evidence.
Yes, it is.
Now, one strategy that you identified that may be useful is what you've referred to as contingency injects. Is that right?
It is.
And that injects are effectively unexpected events that are included in training, where a trainer will deliberately introduce an element of unpredictability. Is that a rough and ready summary anyway?
That's correct, yeah.
Now, one of the examples you've referred to in your report, and it's a paragraph 109, and we don't need to go to it, but it's at page 43. You refer to the example of, quotes, collapsing, close quotes, a crew member when a group is carrying out a practical exercise. Can you help us? What do you mean? What is a collapsing crew in this way?
So it was just an illustration to kind of graphically portray what injecting involves. So effectively, it's to try and take the crew who are fulfilling a task off what the normal trajectory of that task would be, as it were, to take them by surprise in order to kind of compel them to use their initiative and to figure out how they're going to address this difficulty that's now been presented to them. And effectively taking one of their colleagues out out, pretending them to collapse. You've got a firefighter emergency. What do you now do about the situation? Do you continue? Do you rescue your colleague? How do you deal with that situation? There are other examples about you can doing things at night. It's just an example of how you are taking the trajectory of this incident into a different direction in order to gauge how the crews react and in order to test whether they've got an understanding of the options and possibilities that are open to them, and also to see how they would use their initiative to solve problems. And it would be then contingent upon effective debriefing to sort of make sure people have learned from this experience of doing things differently.
And in your experience, there may be a certain irony to this, does the consistent use of unpredictability get crews used to unpredictability?
Absolutely. It's consistency, it's unpredictability. It's to take people by surprise and effectively compel them to have to use their initiative to figure out a way to solve this problem.
Now, another feature which emerged from your earlier answers is the importance of realism in training exercises. And you deal with this in some detail at paragraph 115 of your report, which can be found at page 45. We can go to it, but I don't think we necessarily need to for these questions. There's clearly an importance, which you emphasise there, of exposing crews to realistic training scenarios. How frequently and what range of scenarios do you have to put crews through in order to ensure that they are getting used to the unpredictable nature in which fires can behave in reality?
Is that operational crews or commanders?
Operational crews, and if we take operational crews first and then commanders.
So I think there's two levels for operational crews. Effectively, it's a daily exercise. The LFB have talked about their DAMOP model, the maintenance of operational professionalism, and within that policy they lay out a sort of daily training regime or a programme of training that covers the totality of firefighter responsibilities, which then would entail practical training as well as theoretical training, either on the drill yard or at a risk venue. So they would do both the theoretical and practical training. And during that practical training, which will be organised at the local level, you would anticipate the local watch manager or station manager constantly coming up with ways of just taking crews by surprise. You've now got this, and then this has happened. Whatever the scenario is, there really is always a way just to sort of move it onto a slightly different place to get people consistently using their initiative.
So consistent unpredictability.
Indeed. And then the second dimension to that is it is introducing an element of risk into that situation in training, because it can all feel very sterile. I talk about manufactured realism in the report. One of the problems is if the only place where firefighters practice and rehearse that operational training is on the drill yard at the back of the station with a drill tower that's kind of 4 stories high, then you really need to kind of break that idea. So you do need a range of facilities which are very difficult to provide, but you can give firefighters a more realistic experience in real fire situation and really expose them to real risk. So they genuinely do feel that they are making operational decisions under some kind of pressure in order to coach them to be prepared for that reality at an operational incident. So those are the sort of two dimensions of operational crews.
Thank you. That's a very useful preliminary context looking at the question of realism of training of incident commanders. And one of the points that comes out very vividly in your report, and one point which you explained, that it's important to consider the topic of command training within a context of falling numbers of live fires. Is that a fair summary of the emphasis you want to put on the point?
Yes, it is, Mr. Kinnear, yeah.
And is the number of falling fires a particular issue or contextual point in London?
Yes, it is. I think I produced some kind of graphs that illustrate the fall in London is as acute, if not more acute, than it is in other fire and rescue services, but it's true for all fire and rescue services.
And if we look at, I think the starting point of the analysis, just so people have a reference, is paragraph 124, which is at page 47. And this is where you give the appropriate references should people want to follow that up. Now, you refer to various charts in relation to the London statistics, and could we turn to those, which can be found at page 48, so just over the page? And it's in the top half of the page, And if we could have a look at those particular charts. Now, the top two images illustrate or set out the national figures. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, those both show a decline, indeed a steep decline, in fire incidents in the decade between 2000 and 2010, and then a levelling off. Is that a fair reading of those top two charts?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Now, the bottom two images illustrate the London-specific figures. Is that right?
That's correct.
And again, they show a figure that broadly follows the national picture. Again, is that a reading that
Yeah, I'd agree.
Now, looking at the significance of that decline, is that the opportunity for crews to gain real experience of acting command roles has been reduced, indeed considerably reduced. Is that your view?
It is.
And would you accept that that phenomenon is compounded by the fact that the more senior roles in the fire service entail an increasing level of managerial, non-operational duties?
Yes.
And so, I hope, again, correct me if I put this too crudely, the higher up you go, the opportunities for experiencing command in life situations is proportionately reduced.
I think it's reduced at all levels, but I think the higher up you go, the less frequent you are going to be called out to an operational incident from a command point of view.
Thanks.
Is that saying the same thing, Mr. Kinnear?
I think it is.
Okay.
Now, can we turn to paragraph 126 of your report, which is at page 50? And really, I now want to look at how do you deal with the problem, the consequences of the problem. And you say at paragraph 126 this: the only way of trying to address this loss of life exposure is by the creation of more realism in training events. Now, you've seen the view expressed by Professor Torero in his August report, in which he states that training and realistic training is just one part of the picture, and that what is required is to supplement training by enhancing technical knowledge. Now, first of all, do you agree with that general proposition advanced by Professor Torero?
I do, actually. I think technical knowledge, I should have said that point earlier, I think technical knowledge is a vital component of understanding how to deal with real incidents. But I don't think that purely increasing the level of technical knowledge is the answer either. I think the reality is you need to do both.
And effectively take a holistic approach?
Take a holistic approach and a blended approach. I don't know if you're going to come on to it, but Dr. Cohen-Hatton did a second report where she and I think Mr. Butler produced a very comprehensive suite of training opportunities or training approaches that, when blended together, the evidence suggested went a long way to recreating the benefits of what her research showed from operational incidents. So, in a nutshell, simulation, many of the benefits are achieved by a simulation, but not all of the benefits, particularly those that affect the human factors.
And so the blended approach is one that you'd commend on the basis of your practical experience of incident command over 4 decades?
I think it's essential.
Now, flowing from Professor Torero's point, can we look at the sort of particular aspects of technical knowledge that you think would be useful as part of this holistic approach to the training of incident commanders? Would it involve, as a most basic point, understanding of the risk posed by certain construction materials?
It would, building construction.
Now, what Professor Torero says, again, apologies if I summarise this too crudely, that while the evolution of an internal compartment fire into an external facade fire is a complex matter, once it is observed that a fire has exited the building, the vertical spread of that fire over the facade and its re-entry through the windows could have been predicted. Now, in order to be able to predict that fire behaviour, a commander would need to have the technical knowledge and understanding of what those construction products were and the risks that they posed in terms of potential fire spread. Would you agree with that general proposition?
Partially. I think.
What do you agree with first, and then we'll come on to what you disagree with. So what do you agree with first?
I agree that there is an element of predictability, and quite a lot can be modelled to assist operational decision making.
Where do you disagree with Professor Torero?
So where we disagree is when reality meets theory. So if we take Grenfell as an example, the simultaneous failure of all of the active and passive fire protection measures of the building along with the fire within the cladding, and what Professor Torero refers to as a kind of re-entry of the windows. It wasn't just that the windows enabled fire to re-enter the building. Effectively, the nature of the construction and the workmanship associated with the windows, from a practical point of view, they might as well have not even existed. It wasn't just that there were multiple routes for the fire to come in. It was the fact that they even contributed to the ferocity and speed with which the fire re-entered the building in the first instance. Now, I don't think that is easily modelled. I think Professor Torero does say there are so many variables with some of these models that they end up being oversimplified or unmanageable. I'm maybe paraphrasing, but essentially he said one of the problems with so many variables is you end up at either of those extremes. So I think the reality lies in the middle, that incident commanders need to have sufficient understanding of building construction, fire engineering, fire dynamics, human behaviour, probably those 4 factors, to understand that in this situation, how are those 4 factors interacting with each other against the backdrop of the actual fire and situation that I'm facing. Because it's not just the fire, it is the situation as well.
And presumably they would have to have sufficient technical knowledge as well as experience and the rest of it to modify their approach if the original firefighting response is not effective and is not working.
Entirely. So if Grenfell had been at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and different access, it could have been a very different fire. You know, who would have predicted that the consequences of the cladding, cutting holes, falling? I mean, it's not been mentioned very often, but the LFB need to create a second entry point into Grenfell Tower quite early on into the incident because of the consequence of falling debris, some of those very powerful images of the police with riot shields, and the fact that it was at night, people couldn't see, and so on. So modelling the way the fire might behave in a laboratory or using a computational model is really helpful. It got some predictive power, but in the real world, I would still maintain that it requires a composed individual able to understand the possibilities in front of them and stitch together a workable plan in a very short space of time.
And again, the emphasis on the verb stitch.
I'm sorry if I keep coming back to that expression. It's deliberate. There is no perfect solution. It is a requirement that an incident commander has to stitch together, do the best that they can for this situation.
Thank you. Now, again, this is another point you touched upon in your earlier evidence when you were making certain observations on Professor Johnson's evidence yesterday in relation to communications. Would the need for technical knowledge on the part of incident commanders also embrace knowledge and understanding not only of how communication systems work, but their limitations in respect of certain environments?
In broad terms, yes, Mr. Giafkas. I suppose I should just come back and make one point, if I could, from earlier on this morning when the chairman asked me how long we would expect crews to spend doing a sort of 7.2D inspection. Suppose that question has prompted one thought, which is about radio blind spots and communications blind spots, which is one of the factors of Appendix 1 of 633. That I would expect to be developed or looked at during exercises at risk sites, not necessarily just purely as part of the 7.2D. So this also comes to the awareness of communications. So I think generally speaking, you would expect officers to have an awareness of communications, an awareness of the manner in which you may move channels and control channels at incidents, and you would expect that to be exercised regularly and tested so that you get the command unit out, you'd run leaky feeders out, and so on. So that knowledge wouldn't just be at a theoretical level, it would be that people have been able to apply it in for real.
I think just following on from that answer, I think it also follows on from an answer, the question that the chairman posed of Mr. Brown. Would you expect 72D crews to test their comms equipment whilst carrying out Section 72D visits, or would that be something that was confined to exercises?
I think it would be both. I think yesterday you heard from Professor Johnson that the test that the LFB undertook, people walking up the tower saying, "Can you hear me?" and that kind of slightly cursory, superficial test. Do the radios actually work? I think you would that probably will be more often what will be done on a 7.2D inspection than not. But all of these risk sites would have an exercise plan or a tactical plan. There would be what the LFB call a training solution for each of these sites. And I think it would be, whilst undertaking that training and exercising, part of that would be to test more thoroughly the communications. So wearing breathing apparatus, moving to different parts of the building, and to give it a more rigorous exploration of where there are any blind spots, because it's a known phenomenon.
Because I think that's one of the questions the chairman asked of Mr. Brown. I stand to be corrected that would 7.2D crews wear breathing apparatus and test comms equipment whilst wearing that apparatus? Would that be, in your experience?
It would be unusual. It would be unusual. It would be more the exercising is where you would test the comms of your comms on their relationship and interaction with the building. And I appreciate that's imperfect, by the way.
Well, why is it unusual, though? Because the underlying point that the chairman was making, it seems to be an obvious thing to do, in that you're familiarising yourself with the difficulties that may confront crews if they're attending a fire, say, in a high-rise residential building. So
I think this comes back to the fusing together of the different requirements and into one document, Porous, and then doing a premises risk visit as opposed to a pure 7.2D. I think that you end up separating out functions. So from the operational crew's perspective, as I said earlier, I think in the LFB, they still believe they're doing a computerised 1.1D, and where they would then test the operational implications of that would be training and exercising at the risk site. That would be the convention, if you will. Looking at it cold in the light of day from Grenfell, whether that's the way to go forward in light of what we now know about Grenfell is a matter for the inquiry. But I think that certainly would be the convention of most fire and rescue services.
Thank you. Mr. McGuirk, thank you very much for your further evidence in respect of the comms issues. Could I go back and just look at some specific instances of technical knowledge that incident commanders may or may not be expected to hold? Professor Johnson, in his report, explained that radio signals produced by low-powered ultra-high-frequency UHF radios may not be capable of penetrating large amounts of concrete or metal, and therefore may not perform well in 1970s concrete high-rise buildings. Is that the level of technical knowledge you would expect an incident commander to hold?
Yes.
Would you agree that if an incident commander held that technical knowledge, he or she would be in a better position to make an informed decision to permit the use of stronger radios, or indeed airwave radios, at an early stage of an incident in a high-rise building?
Yes, I would. I would anticipate that would have been exercised. So I would anticipate incident commanders being quite familiar with that.
In your experience, that is something that would be done at an early stage in an incident, would it?
Certainly in an early stage, part of setting up the incident command structure would be to establish your communications infrastructure and make sure that you've got the right channel allocation, which for most incidents would have been preordained. And I think Professor Johnson went through those yesterday without going through kind of the various channels. As the incident scales up, you would get the command unit on, and the command unit would normally have people with a higher level of skills and knowledge in how to establish a slightly more expansive and comprehensive communications infrastructure for the fireground.
Now, would it flow from that you'd expect consideration by an incident commander of radio enhancing technology? And I'm thinking here of repeaters, etc.
I would, and you would expect either making a communications sector a dedicated sector so that you would have an officer solely focused on that, or in some fire rescue services they would have professional radio technicians, non-uniformed qualified radio technicians that will be mobilised alongside the command unit to incidents.
In your experience, what level and what depth of technical knowledge would you expect an incident commander to have of the advantages and limitations of enhancing technology such as feeders?
A reasonably good knowledge. I mean, well, the two types of feeders, both the radio feeders and the telemetry feeders, and they are very, very different things. I think at a basic level, understanding the difference between those two would be absolutely a prerequisite. But I expect them to have a pretty good understanding of, because our comms infrastructure is an essential part of command and control. I mean, I think I would add that one of the other dimensions here is the ease, the kind of usability of the equipment itself. Certainly from my experience at the design stage of things like command units and the procurement of equipment, you'd be looking to get sort of one switch type equipment or making it easy to set up extra antennae, boosters, and so on. You'd like to make the equipment itself as straightforward as possible, which may require some adaptations, but you'd also expect incident commanders to have a good knowledge of how to use the equipment in terms of a comms infrastructure.
Thank you. Now, you will have seen that Professor Torero in his August report refers to a disregard that he's identified for the value of technical knowledge on the part of the LFB. What would be your response to that particular criticism?
So I think the technical knowledge sits in a different place. I think if you take the LFB as a generality, as a collective organisation, I would suggest there's quite a lot of technical knowledge sitting within the fire safety function of the organisation. But I think we've heard from a number of witnesses already that sort of expressed a desire for fire safety to have whatever the right expression is, a bigger seat at the table or some such expression, certainly to be
An enhanced role.
Enhanced role. So I think the LFB, and that in fairness is how most fire and rescue services approach, as it were, technical knowledge on the fire safety side. It would be vested in your fire safety departments, and many fire and rescue services now have qualified fire engineers, doctorates, and so on. I think that would be one dimension. I think it is also fair to say that the extent to which the technical knowledge of operational officers in some of the phenomenon like breaches of compartmentation, modern methods of construction, cladding and so on, new materials, new approaches, I think the LFB struggles in that area.
Can you flesh out that latter response slightly more? What examples, what particular instances have weighed most heavily with you in reaching the conclusion that the LFB struggled on those points?
To be frank, Mr. Kinnear, I don't think a single officer, with the exception of Station Manager Egan, actually recognised a breach in compartmentation. I've not seen a single mention in the witness statements of any officer in the command chain that really fundamentally suggested to me they understood what had happened in terms of a breach of compartmentation.
And its consequences?
And the implications of what that meant in terms of operational firefighting decisions, yes.
Thank you. Slightly different aspect of that point, but could I ask us to go to page 49 of your report? And it's Roman 4. And it's the first sentence, and you say there, there's a risk of, quotes, artificially inflated confidence and blind faith in procedures themselves. And you go on to identify the danger that, quotes, compliance with procedure and following a process becomes the goal. Now, would you say that that's an illustration of the problem that commanders are not or have insufficient technical knowledge to be able to formulate a tailored plan? And so the objective becomes simply to follow procedure rather than effectively extinguishing the fire and saving life.
I think that's a fair summary.
Would you, following on from that, would you agree with Professor Torero's observation in his April report that the current training and education within the fire and rescue services generally tends to emphasise plan execution, which I think is a synonym for following procedure, rather than plan formulation?
I'm not sure what his evidence is for that. I'm not so sure I have enough evidence to offer a kind of clear judgment on that, Mr. Kinnear. Do all fire and rescue services, I think it's a big statement. I'm not sure I've got any evidence of that.
Thank you. We dealt with earlier on in evidence the complex question of operational discretion, and I said we'd be coming to that. Well, we're coming to it now. Now, we probably best start with a definition, and operational discretion is another measure designed to encourage the exercise of initiative by incident commanders specifically, and you've set out a broader definition of the concept which derives from national guidance, as you adverted to in earlier evidence, and that's set out at paragraph 111 of your report at page 44. And we can see there the italicised quotes, and I shall read it into the record. It says this: operational discretion relates to rare or exceptional circumstances where strictly following an operational procedure would be a barrier to resolving an incident, or where there is no procedure that adequately deals with the incident. Commanders need to be sufficiently aware of procedures, the skills and qualities of crew members, and the capability of resources available, and the overarching principle should be that, in the opinion of the incident commander, the benefit of taking unusual, unorthodox, or innovative action justifies the risk. Is it fair to say that the first point to emphasise there is the rarity and exceptional nature of the reliance upon operational discretion?
It is. Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah, and it's a discretion, am I right in assuming that it's reserved to incident commanders alone, no one else?
Yes.
Now, looking at paragraph 113 of your report, and particularly the first and second sentences, you set out there that you have reviewed the LFB's policy document that sets out the remit of operational discretion. We don't need to go to it, but is it correct that you observe there that the policy document is comprehensive, but that the question is the extent to which officers, in practical terms, feel able to rely upon operational discretion when it's necessary and desirable to do so?
Yes, and I think I refer in the footnote to a kind of quote from the report of a managing inspector that talks about the kind of culture of debrief did not appear to lend itself to openness in that way.
And there's 2 points really I'd like to take you to in this regard. First of all is the report by Ribbon Star, and second, if we can look at the inspectorate report. Looking at the first one by Ribbon Star, that was an independent review of training commissioned by the LFB after Grenfell. And that noted, I think materially, that there was no formal training on operational discretion in place at the time of the review. Is that a correct summary of the report's findings?
Yes, it is.
Does that accord with your own assessment of the evidence that you have seen?
Yeah, I've seen no evidence.
You referred to earlier on to the inspectorate report, and that noted, I think I'm right to say, that there was, quotes, a strikingly low, close quotes, use of the policy, and suggested that the explanation was essentially cultural, namely a lack of confidence on the part of incident commanders that the necessary support was there. Again, is that a fair summary of the inspectorate's conclusions?
It is. If I could just link those to my comment on in paragraph 113, though, about the comprehensiveness and restrictions. The sense you've got when you put those two together is, whilst operational discretion was first introduced with GRA 3.2, and I appreciate the inquiry will be looking in detail about the development of GRA 3.2, but therefore it was a national policy. So the sense I got was that a policy needs to be in place, but the framing of the policy language really discourages, quite strongly discourages, the use of operational discretion rather than seeing it as an important enabling piece of policy, I guess.
So to that extent, am I right in assuming that you consider the inspectorate's criticism to be well made?
It was well made, and I think that speaks to the culture of debriefing, that where people may have used it, then they didn't feel that they would be supported for having done so.
And I think I'm right in putting it this way, that your explanation for the phenomenon of the strikingly low take-up rate is a combination of discouragement in the policy and general cultural reasons as to why operational discretion isn't exercised more consistently.
I'd add one other addition to that, if I could, Mr. Kinnear, which is the existence of a number of teams of operational review officers, or teams of functions monitoring officers. We've heard about service standard support officers. There were a number of layers of inspection / audit / assurance that seem to kind of anchor in observance of policy as being the central kind of tenet of the organisation's culture.
And it really flows from that. We dealt with it in the past, but you've observed previously in the report to an artificially inflated confidence and blind faith in procedures themselves, and compliance with procedure and following a process becomes the goal. Do you think that reluctance to depart from procedure is an explanation for the lack of confidence on part of incident commanders?
I do. I think it speaks to the same point, yes.
Sorry, if you just let me finish the question.
Sorry,
it's just for the transcriber's benefit. But that's part of the explanation for the lack of confidence on the part of incident commanders.
Yes, sorry, I'd agree.
I suppose the flip side of all of this is how do you ensure that operational discretion is appropriately exercised? How do you go about that?
So I think when it is, you debrief it in the right, with the right frame of mind to start from a proposition that the officer making the decision to apply the discretion did it for the right reasons and that they faced exceptional circumstances. And then you take the learning from that and you publicise it far and wide and candidly you milk it for all it's worth to get. I mentioned earlier about the kind of culture. You need to communicate that widely in order to send a very strong signal to the organisation and incident commanders that because this sits against the backdrop of health and safety and the risks of being criticised for taking decisions that step outside procedure. So it's a very tricky balance for incident commanders. You need to be able to give them confidence that they will be supported when they step outside procedure, but by the same token, there's not a carte blanche to do anything that they wish to do. And so to try and get the boundaries of where those lines can be drawn, when it happens, you need to debrief it, and as I say, you need to communicate it and publicise it along the lines of the outcomes of a Lakenhell type incident. You would use that kind of process to make sure the whole organisation was aware that it had happened and that there's learning from this and that everybody had something to learn from that incident.
Put bluntly, is one difficulty facing the brigade that commanders are unable safely to identify when the circumstances call for the exercise of operational discretion?
Yes, and I think the Blue Ribbon talks about a recommendation about trying to provide some boundaries or some parameters when it might be applied, or some examples to give commanders a clue of the kinds of circumstances within which it would probably be appropriate.
I think I stand to be corrected, but I think the report refers to various cues to be provided to incident commanders.
Yes, I think it does, yes.
Thank you. Can we now turn to the question and the topic of firefighting on the night of the 14th of June 2017? Now, I'm right in saying, but please shout if this is not so, that you have reviewed training materials, including the incident command training materials that have been provided to the inquiry by the LFB.
I have.
Thank you. And in your report at paragraphs 143 to 148, which can be found at pages 54 through to 57, you've made a number of observations based on the materials that you have reviewed at the time you drafted your report.
I have.
Thank you. And that since you finalised your report, you've been provided with and reviewed a number of additional incident command training materials that have been subsequently provided to the inquiry by the LFB. Is that right?
That's right.
Am I right in understanding that none of those additional materials that you have reviewed has given you cause to change any of the views that you've previously expressed in your report about the adequacy of the LFB's incident command training?
If anything, they strengthened the point.
So the opinions that you've expressed in paragraphs 143 to 148 of your report remain an accurate reflection of your view of the adequacy of the LFB's incident command training, taking into account the additional material that you've been provided with and which you've now considered?
They do.
Thank you. Now, can we turn, first of all, to the question of water and its use on the night? Now, you address this at paragraph 151 onwards in your report, which is at page 58. Before we deal with the substance, can I deal with a number of preliminary matters? First of all, you're not a water supply expert, is that fair to say?
That's fair.
And the opinions you have set out in your report relate purely to the operational side of water supply. That's to say, how the LFB managed the available water on the night and whether they were sufficiently aware of and took steps to address any issues in relation to water supply.
That's correct.
And you have not been asked to give any opinion on the water supply to the incident from the network on the night of the fire.
No.
And you have not been provided with any data that would enable you to make any such assessment in any event.
No.
Thank you. Now, would it be correct to say that ensuring the provision of an adequate water supply is a fundamental function of incident command?
Yes, it is.
And broadly speaking, would it be correct to summarise your conclusion by saying that, in your view, the command structure in place on the night of the fire failed to adequately fulfil that function, at least until the early morning when Station Manager Peyton was mobilised?
That's correct.
Now, that is a broad proposition, and if I could look at some of the component elements of it so that you can amplify your reasoning in evidence. Now, Your conclusion was informed by a number of points. First of all, can we look at the bulk media advisor? First of all, what is a bulk media advisor?
So it would be a specialist officer who had received extra training in how to fulfil the role of providing for an additional water supply, the equipment that you would use and some of the theory behind doing so, and therefore they would be able to attend an incident and, as it were, take that responsibility, that thought process away from the incident commander within the incident command structure to then to be able to establish, to focus on establishing a water supply. I mean, the bulk media aspect is slightly, I suppose, confusing. It would be predominantly water, but for some incidents, foam may be a necessary kind of extinguishing medium, so foam would fall into that category as well. But for the purposes of the inquiry, I think it would be useful just to say it predominantly will be water.
Thank you. And at Grenfell, at least in the early stages, Group Manager Welsh was the bulk media advisor, and he arrived at around 0200 hours. Is that right?
He was mobilised for that reason, yes.
Thank you. Now, Group Manager Welsh did not continue in that role, but briefly took over, or purported to take over, command of the incident, and then was designated the fire sector commander by DAC O'Loughlin, who was the incident commander. The point you make in your report is that there appears to have been no discussion of water supplies by anyone at that particular stage. Is that right?
That's correct.
And drilling down more specifically, there'd been no discussion about the fact that there was no person fulfilling the role of bulk media advisor, given Group Manager Welsh's change in role. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct. I mean, DAC O'Loughlin had been to the actual instance and taken command there. Group Manager Welsh had gone straight to the command unit and made pumps 40, which is, from a London point of view, a very big decision. It's very rare to make that number of appliances. And so there was a sense that this was clearly, in everybody's perspective, a very significant incident. And I would have anticipated, therefore, a discussion about the necessary water supplies.
Would discussion of water supplies be a standard topic of discussion in any handover?
Yeah, to be frank, yes. It's a pretty basic component to put a fire out, isn't it? I mean, there's lots of technical discussion about how water extinguishes fire and the way it can be applied and so on, but at its most basic level, it's been around for 2,000 years to put water on a fire. I think that most people would understand that.
And again, apologies if I put this too crudely, and correct me if I have done. During DAC O'Loughlin's time as incident commander, you say that there was similarly again no consideration about whether a replacement bulk media advisor was needed to be mobilised. Is that a fair summary of your view?
I couldn't find any evidence of that.
And indeed, there was no meaningful consideration of what steps needed to be taken more generally in order to secure an adequate water supply. Again, is that a fair reflection of your view?
Again, yeah, I find no evidence.
Now, AC Rose, he then was, assumed command of the incident at 0243 hours. And again, for a number of hours after this, it appears that there was no meaningful discussion or consideration of water supply by anyone within the command structure. Is that, again, a fair assessment of your reading of the evidence?
Yes.
And in particular, there was no discussion of the need to mobilise a bulk media advisor. Again, is that a fair summary of your view?
It is.
Would it be correct to observe that throughout this time, the operational response was facing difficulties to a lesser or greater extent with water supply?
From the evidence, it's yes, there were various reports of problems with water supply throughout the incident.
And to give a concrete example, Alpha 245, the ALP on the east side of the tower, had experienced problems in securing an adequate supply of water from the ALP's monitor, and the crew were having to improvise by using a hose fixed onto a cage. Is that right?
That's right. It was lashed to a hook, yes.
Now, is it a fair summary of your evidence that these difficulties with water supply were simply not taken into account by those in command until much later in the incident?
That's correct.
And in fact, a bulk media advisor was only requested at 0600 hours. Is that right?
That's correct. Station Manager Payton, I think.
Yes. And Station Manager Payton arrived at about 0630 hours, and you estimate that it would have been closer to 0730 hours by the time he had been briefed and got an informed sense of the incident. Again, is that a fair summary of your view?
It is.
Now, at that stage in the incident, so from around 0:30 hours onwards, are you able to give a view as to whether there were steps that Station Manager Payton could have taken materially to improve the situation, or is it your view by that time it was essentially too late?
Essentially, it was too late. I think the incident was in what I would call its decay phase, in the sense that it was moving to a situation where it was effectively starting to burn itself out. And so I think that the water supplies came within the envelope of the fire itself by that stage, rather than, as it were, trying to extinguish the fire on the other side of that equation.
Again, I hope I don't put this too simplistically, but is your view in essence there was little, if anything effective, Station Manager Peyton could have done by the time he arrived on site?
It would not have been able to materially affect the outcome of that incident differently, no.
Thank you. I now want to turn to issues relating to the use of certain types of equipment on the night of the fire, and in particular how effective these bits of equipment were. Now, you address this topic from paragraph 168 onwards in your report. That can be found at page 63 onwards. Now, specifically, I want to ask you about the equipment that was used for the purposes of external firefighting, and two items of equipment that were used inside the tower, namely a positive pressure ventilation fan and a lightweight portable pump. Now, if I can first of all deal with external firefighting. Now, you've considered in detail both the aerial appliances that were used as part of the external firefighting and ground monitors. Now, it should be stated that in addition to those two forms of water appliances, there are a number of handheld jets in use on all external sides of the building as well. Is that a fair summary?
It is.
Now, in relation to the aerial appliances, you have noted that it was just Alpha 245, which came from Soho, and Alpha 213, which was Paddington's turntable ladder, that were actually operational during the period up until 0830 hours. Is that right?
That's correct.
And of those two, Alpha 213, so the turntable ladder, was only used for a relatively short period of time before it had to be moved back from its position outside the tower due to falling debris. Is that right?
It was. I think it attempted a rescue on the south face of the tower relatively briefly, but then was returned and pulled back under the canopy.
Thank you. And just to set some more context in relation to ground monitors, first of all, can you briefly explain what is a ground monitor?
So a ground monitor, so it's probably used to do it with a distinction to a handheld jet. A handheld jet is, as the name suggests, normally two personnel with holes into which is connected what you would call a nozzle or a jet, and that would normally deliver means through a pump. The holes would impart pressure through the pump, put the water through the holes, and the two firefighters would hold the jet and point it at the fire. The issues with that are there's a limit to how much pressure you can put through the holes because it creates a jet reaction, and there's a limit to which two people can control that. You might need three people on occasions, so there are limits. So when you're trying to throw water at height because you're overcoming the effects of gravity, then there is a real tricky balance between pressure and flow and jet reaction. A ground monitor, on the other hand, is a fixed piece of apparatus. It's a monitor stuck into, if you like, a metal casting, and you connect the holes to the casting. Professor Dr. Grimm was talking about breaching, so he was talking about a dividing breaching, there's a collecting breaching that does the reverse, so 2 into 1 as opposed to 1 into 2. And you can then normally put a greater pressure through a ground monitor and therefore get a higher throw because the jet reaction goes into the ground. The ground absorbs the jet reaction through the feet of the ground monitor moulding, if you like.
Thank you, Mr. McGuirk.
Does that explain? Is that hopefully clear?
It does. Mr. McGuirk, may I repeat my plea in relation to pace?
Sorry.
I'm afraid I think the shorthand writer was struggling at points there, so if you could speak more slowly, that would be much appreciated. Now, looking at the ground monitor, if you've noted that there was a ground monitor that was operational for most of the duration of the incident on the south side of the tower, is that right?
That's correct.
And specifically, it was located on the walkway immediately in front of the tower, is that right?
That's correct.
And essentially you state that you've seen evidence suggest that there might have been ground monitors in use on other sides of the tower, but the evidence you've seen is not conclusive. Have I summarised your view correctly?
You have.
Thank you. And how many other ground monitors do you think were in use? Or potentially could have been in use?
Potentially up to 4. DAC O'Loughlin does, I think, sent a message back saying 4 ground monitors in use, and I think in his witness statement and or his evidence mentioned he thought there were 4. I've not seen evidence of any picture of that, but I've no reason to suggest he's anything other than telling the truth. I've seen evidence probably of 2, but it could equally be up to 4.
Thank you. Now, is it your view that the LFB's response was, on the whole, effective, in particular at reducing downward fire spread?
Yes, and I think I cite the experts' reports of Dr. Lane and Professor Bisbee. On the limitations of that, notwithstanding, there's a water supply expert, and I'm sure we'll talk about water supply more generally. Within those constraints, I think the crews did a reasonably effective job at controlling the fire and its downward spread and being able to, and I think the pattern of where the fire got to very much reflects their ability to put water onto the external face of the tower. I think I do also make the point that stopping downward spread of a fire is a very different proposition.
We'll come on to that, Mr. McGuirk. Can we take each component elements of your view? Now, you referred both in your answer and in the report to an image in Dr. Barbara Lane's report, which provided analysis of the external fire spread and how that correlated with the external firefighting efforts. And could we look at that image briefly? Page 69 of your report, and it's figure 5. And if that could be expanded. The top image shows the approximate water reach on the north and west sides of the building, is that right?
It is.
And we can see that there's been some effect in reducing downward spread on both of those sides, up to floor 9 on the north side and floor 7 on the west. Again, have I summarised matters correctly?
You have.
To be clear, there were no aerial appliances or ground monitors on either the north or west sides until later in the incident. Is that right?
That's correct.
So the effects that are illustrated by this image are likely to have been achieved by handheld jets. Is that your view?
Yes, handheld jets or monitors, yes.
Now, the bottom image shows the approximate water reach on the south and east sides of the building. There's been more extensive effect there, up to floor 10 on the south side and as high as floor 18 on the east side. Again, is that a fair reading of those two images?
It is.
Would the more extensive water reach reflect the use of a ground monitor on the south side and the aerial ladder platform on the east?
That would be my conclusion, yes.
In terms of whether anything more could have been done to reduce fire spread on the outside of the building, you've explained that it is difficult for you to offer an opinion and that this would involve a significant element of speculation. Have I summarised your position fairly?
Yes.
And looking at the components of that, in particular, aerial appliances were not able to access all sides of the tower. Is that right?
That's correct, although there is some evidence of the possible attempt to try on the west side, which was prevented by kind of concrete bollards. But yes, in the event, there was no application of aerial appliances. And
the crew of Alpha 245 itself had considerable difficulties, in your view, pitching the ALP and had to operate outside of procedure in order to set it up on a grass verge.
They did, yes.
And as we've referred to in relation to Alpha 213, there were challenges posed by falling debris, which meant that the appliance could not be safely used. Is that a fair reflection of your view?
It is. I would say I think they put themselves at particular risk, actually. So not only from the falling debris, but they were unable to extend the jacks of the vehicle. And so that would have put it in a more unstable position than it would have probably been safe to do. That was quite a courageous approach that they took.
Drawing the various strands of your view together, again, correct me if I'm summarising this too crudely or unfairly. What you're saying is that it's not possible to say whether, even had an aerial appliance of greater reach been available at some unspecified time, but earlier in the incident, that would have materially improved the external firefighting response.
I don't think it's possible to say one way or the other.
Thank you. Sir, it is 1 o'clock.
Yes, is that a convenient point for you?
It is. Thank you, sir.
Right, well, that's obviously a good point at which to take a break for lunch, Mr. McGuirk. We'll stop there and we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please. And again, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're away from the room.
Thanks, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. 2 o'clock. Then,
Thanks,
please.
sir.